The summer Evelyn Carter's husband died, the wheat was still green. That was the cruelest part of it. Not the fever that took Thomas in 4 days. Not the way he went delirious on the second night and called her by his mother's name. Not even the sound of the dirt hitting the pine box they lowered him into on a Tuesday morning with no preacher and no ceremony because there was no money for either. The cruelest part was the wheat standing out there in the field, chest high and almost ready, swaying in the Kansas wind like it didn't know yet, like it hadn't gotten the news. Evelyn stood at the window of the farmhouse for a long time after the burial, watching those green stalks move. Her 3 daughters were behind her. Maggie at 9, the oldest, and already too quiet about things. Lily at 8, who had stopped humming to herself sometime in the past week and hadn't started again. And Grace at 7, who didn't fully understand and kept asking when Papa was coming back inside. Soon, Evelyn had told her that first day. She didn't say it again after that. Thomas Carter had not been a careful man with money. Evelyn had known this when she married him, had loved him anyway, had spent 12 years watching him shake hands on deals that fell apart and borrow against harvests that came up short. He was generous to a fault, and optimistic past the point of reason, and she had always been the one quietly figuring out how to stretch what they had. But she had never known, until the creditors started arriving, exactly how bad it was. The first man came 3 days after the funeral. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket, and told her apologetically that Thomas had borrowed against the equipment. The second man came the following week and explained the mortgage situation in a voice carefully emptied of emotion. The third man didn't bother with apology at all. By the end of July, Evelyn understood that the farm was gone. The house was gone. The equipment was gone. What she had left was 3 children, a small trunk of clothing, and a distant relative named Harold Pruitt, who sent a letter offering to help. She should have known better. She had met Harold Pruitt twice in her life and had not liked him either time. A thin, watchful man with the kind of smile that arrived a half second after it should have, like he was calculating whether it was worth the effort. But she was 31 years old with 3 daughters and nowhere to go. And Harold Pruitt's letter said he had a house in Red Creek and connections and could arrange things. She took his offer. Red Creek, Kansas sat at the edge of what people called civilization, which meant it had a main street, 2 saloons, a hardware store, a bank, and a courthouse that doubled as a meeting hall. It did not have much patience for hard luck stories. The frontier had been eating hard luck stories for decades and had developed a certain immunity to them. Harold Pruitt's house was on the east end of town, a 2-story building that was better kept on the outside than the inside. He had a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldrich who looked at Evelyn and the girls the way you'd look at a stray dog that's followed you home. Not unkind exactly, just assessing, already calculating the cost. "You'll stay in the back rooms," Harold said, showing them up the stairs. "There's work to be done in the mornings. The girls can help with the laundry and the kitchen." Evelyn looked at him. "They're children." "Children in this town work," Harold said. He wasn't unkind about it either. That was what she'd come to think of as his particular talent. He said things that should have been cruel and somehow made them sound like reasonable observations. "You'll want to make yourselves useful. People around here notice." She didn't argue. She needed time to figure out what came next, and arguing with Harold Pruitt on the first night wasn't going to get her there faster. What came next, she discovered over the following 6 weeks, was worse than she'd imagined. Harold Pruitt was not a man who helped people out of generosity. He was a man who helped people out of calculation, and what he was calculating, Evelyn came to understand, was what she and her daughters were worth, not in any simple way. He wasn't a bad man in the obvious sense. He didn't raise his hand to them, didn't drink, went to services every Sunday, and nodded to the right people on the street. But he had a way of talking about the future that made Evelyn's skin crawl, a way of saying things like, "A woman in your position has to be practical, and those girls need to start learning what life actually is," that she recognized eventually as the sound of a door closing. He had debts of his own, she pieced together. Business deals that hadn't worked out, people he owed money to. And in Red Creek in 1887, a woman with 3 children and no husband and no money of her own had approximately no legal standing to refuse very much. The night he told her his plan, she was washing dishes after supper, and he came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and talked to her back. "There's a thing done sometimes," he said, When a family's in debt and can't pay. Labor contracts. Somebody buys the contract, gets the work, eventually the debt gets settled. Evelyn set down the plate she was holding. What are you saying? I'm saying it's legal, Harold said. It's done. Families in worse spots than yours have gone through it. She turned around. He was watching her with that half-second delayed expression, already measuring her reaction. You want to sell us, she said. It's not selling. It's a contract arrangement, a business transaction. You'd be placed with a family or a business that needs workers, the girls too, and the debt gets cleared. It's not permanent. It's permanent enough, she said. Harold's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something more patient and more frightening. Evelyn, you don't have a choice here. You have no money, no property, no husband, and 4 months of debt to my name now. I've been generous, but I have my own obligations. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the back room with Grace curled against her side and Maggie and Lily on the other bed, listening to her youngest daughter breathe, thinking about options that weren't there. She thought about running. She thought about it in detail, mapping distances, calculating how far they could get on foot before Harold noticed they were gone. But she had no money, no destination, no one to run to, and 3 children who couldn't run fast or far. She thought about fighting and kept coming up against the same wall. The law in 1887 did not particularly care what she thought. By morning, she hadn't found a way out. What she had found, instead, was a very specific and focused fury, the kind that doesn't show on your face, that you hold in your chest like a coal you keep banking, saving for when you need it. The auction was set for a Thursday. Harold didn't call it an auction. He called it a contract placement. And the men who showed up in the town square that morning nodded and called it that too, because the word mattered, apparently, even when the thing was the same. There were 8 or 10 of them gathered by 9 o'clock, ranchers mostly, a couple of businessmen from the far end of town, and a handful of onlookers who'd heard about it and come to watch the way people come to watch things they tell themselves later they didn't want to see. Evelyn dressed her daughters carefully that morning. She had done their hair and made them put on their best clothes, not because she wanted them to look presentable for sale, but because she needed them to look like people, like someone's children. She needed any man who looked at them to have to work at not seeing that. Maggie had understood enough to go quiet and steady, her jaw set in a way that looked like Thomas. Lily had cried until she ran out of tears and then stood up straight with swollen eyes. Grace had held Evelyn's hand and asked, for the last time, if they were going somewhere new. Maybe, Evelyn said. It was the most honest answer she could give. The square in Red Creek was not large. The courthouse steps served as the platform, and Harold stood at the top of them with his papers and his reasonable voice, while Evelyn and the girls stood below on the second step, slightly apart, Evelyn positioned between her daughters and the crowd in the only way she could manage. She kept her back straight because she'd decided she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching her fold. Harold was explaining the terms. 4 years on the contract, labor in exchange for housing and food, and a modest wage that would go toward clearing the debt. When Evelyn heard the crowd shift, not a sound exactly, more a change in the weight of attention. She didn't look right away. She was watching a heavy-set rancher at the front of the crowd, who'd already made one comment she hadn't liked, something about the girls being young enough to train up right, and she was making sure she had his face memorized. Then someone near her said, "Lo, that's Mercer." She looked then. He was standing at the back of the crowd, which was why she'd missed him coming. Caleb Mercer was not the kind of man you noticed gradually. He was the kind you noticed all at once, the way you notice a weather change. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and his face had the particular look of a man who'd spent a lot of years outside doing hard work, deeply lined, not unkind, but very far from soft. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he had his arms folded across his chest, and he was watching the proceedings on the courthouse steps with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Not the expression of a man enjoying himself. That much she could tell. He wasn't moving, he was just watching. But something about the way the crowd had shifted when he arrived told her that his watching mattered to people in a way that other men's watching didn't. Harold had gotten to the bidding part. He was saying the words in his calm, reasonable way, and Evelyn heard Grace make a small sound beside her, and she reached back without looking and found her youngest daughter's hand. "Don't," she said quietly. Not harshly, just the word, flat and steady. Grace didn't cry. The heavy-set rancher at the front spoke first, made an offer for Evelyn and the two older girls. "Old enough to work," he said, which was a sentence Evelyn filed away in that coal-banking part of herself. A second man countered for just Evelyn and Maggie. A third man who ran a laundry on the far end of town offered something for Lily and Grace together. The idea of her daughters being separated hit Evelyn somewhere below her ribs. She had known intellectually that it was possible. Knowing it and hearing it spoken aloud in a public square on a Thursday morning were different things entirely. "I'll take all four." The voice came from the back of the crowd. Chab. Everything stopped. That was what it felt like, the bidding, the noise, even Harold's reasonable voice trailing off mid-sentence. The crowd turned, and Evelyn could suddenly see Caleb Mercer clearly as the people between them shifted. He hadn't moved from his spot. His arms were still folded. He said it the way a man says something he's already made up his mind about. Not a question, not a negotiation opener. Just a statement of fact waiting to be processed. Harold blinked. "Mr. Mercer, I said I'll take all four, together. What's the contract for all of them?" Harold looked down at his papers with the expression of a man recalculating. The heavy-set rancher at the front turned around and looked at Mercer with an expression that was not friendly. One of the other bidders made a sound under his breath. "The combined contract for Mrs. Carter and her 3 daughters," Harold began. "I heard the terms," Mercer said. "What's the number?" Harold told him. Mercer said, "Done." Me? He didn't come up to them right away. He waited while Harold finished his paperwork. Harold had a lot of paperwork, which Evelyn supposed was the point, to make a thing that was ugly look like a business transaction. And then the crowd began to drift away in the way crowds do after something's over. A little loud, not quite meeting each other's eyes. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps with her daughters gathered close and waited. He walked across the square toward them, and she had time in those 30 or so feet to decide what she was going to say and not say. She had spent the morning deciding she would not thank anyone. She would not perform gratitude for being rescued from a situation she should never have been put in. He stopped a few feet away. Up close, the lines on his face were deeper. A man who'd had some hard years and wasn't pretending otherwise. His eyes were a specific gray that she found difficult to categorize. Not cold, not warm, just present, in a way that felt like he was actually looking at her, rather than at the idea of her. "Caleb Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch about 12 miles out, Twin Pines." "I know who you are," she said. He didn't seem surprised by that. "Then you know I run a working operation. I need hands who can do real work. Your family does the work. You'll be housed and fed and paid, and the contract gets cleared in 4 years. I won't misrepresent that. It's 4 years of labor. But you'll be together." Maggie was looking at him with the kind of focused attention she gave things she was trying to figure out. Lily was still holding Evelyn's hand. Grace had moved to stand slightly behind Evelyn's left hip, but she was peering around at Mercer with something that wasn't quite fear. Evelyn said, "And after 4 years?" Mercer looked at her steadily. "After 4 years, the contract's done and you go wherever you want." It wasn't a promise of kindness. It wasn't a speech about saving them or giving them a new life. It was a statement of terms, delivered plainly, and something about the plainness of it was the first thing in weeks that she halfway believed. "All right," she said. She didn't say thank you. He didn't seem to expect it. The wagon was a battered flatbed with a reasonable team, and Mercer drove it himself rather than having a hand do it, which told her a small thing about him that she filed away. The girls sat in the back. Evelyn sat on the bench beside Mercer with approximately 2 feet of distance between them and watched Red Creek fall away behind them. Grace, after about 10 minutes of unusual silence, leaned over the side of the wagon and let her hand drag through the long grass at the edge of the road. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Are there animals at your ranch?" "Some," Mercer said without turning around. "What kind?" "Horses, cattle, a dog." He paused. "Chickens." Grace appeared to be weighing this information carefully. "What kind of dog?" "Big one," Mercer said. "Brown." "What's his name?" "Scout." Another pause from Grace. Evelyn looked sideways and could see, in her peripheral vision, Mercer's jaw muscles doing something that wasn't quite a smile. "Is he friendly?" Grace asked. "To people he knows," Mercer said. "How does he decide if he knows you?" "Takes time," Mercer said. "He's careful." Grace seemed satisfied with this. She pulled her hand back in from the grass and sat up straighter. Evelyn turned to look forward at the road, and for the first time in weeks felt something that was not exactly relief but was adjacent to it, a loosening in her chest, brief and small, and not to be trusted yet. She didn't trust it, but she noticed it. Twin Pines Ranch declared itself before they arrived. First the fence line, running straight and repaired recently by the look of it. No sagging posts, no gaps she could see. Then the road turning to a better grade of dirt as they came up toward the main house. The two pines that gave the place its name standing at the entrance like they'd been there since before anyone thought to name anything. Then the house itself, a two-story structure that was not large but was solid, built to last rather than built to impress. A good-sized barn to the east, a bunkhouse past it, a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that was better tended than most. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up, somewhere in his 30s, wiry, with a face full of sun damage and an expression that defaulted to wariness. "Pete Halloran," Mercer said to Evelyn, without getting down yet. "He's my foreman. Been here 11 years. Pete Halloran looked at the wagon and its passengers with an expression that did not visibly warm during the looking. He nodded at Mercer. "You'll get them settled?" Mercer said. "Where?" Pete said. "The east rooms, both of them." Mercer climbed down from the wagon. "Ask Mrs. Vance to put together something for supper." Pete looked at Evelyn with the same careful assessment. She looked back without expression. "Right," Pete said, and went. Mrs. Vance was the cook, a stout woman in her 50s with flour on her forearms and opinions she was not immediately sharing. She showed them the two east-facing rooms on the second floor, which were small and plain and had windows that looked out over the kitchen garden, and brought up extra blankets without being asked. Grace discovered almost immediately that Scout was asleep under the stairs and stood regarding him from a respectful distance with tremendous interest. Scout opened one eye and regarded her back. "Leave him," Evelyn said. "I'm not touching him," Grace said in a tone that suggested she had merely been thinking about it. Lily went to the window in their room and looked out at the garden for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "It's bigger than our place was." "The ranch?" "The garden." She paused. "We didn't grow beans." Evelyn sat down on the edge of one of the beds, which was harder than she'd expected, and also the first solid surface she'd sat on in days that felt like it would hold. Her back ached. Her head ached. Everything ached. Maggie sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Maggie said, "He doesn't seem mean." Evelyn said, "No." "But you don't trust him." "I don't trust anyone right now," Evelyn said. "That's not a reflection on him specifically." Maggie sat with that for a moment, then, "That seems fair." Evelyn put her arm around her oldest daughter, and they sat there together in the small plain room while the Kansas afternoon light moved through the window, and Grace continued her cautious standoff with a large brown dog at the bottom of the stairs, and Lily looked at the garden and thought about things she didn't say yet, and the ranch made its usual end-of-day sounds around them. Horses shifted in the barn, a gate clanged, a man's voice said something indistinct across the yard. Supper that first night was awkward in the specific way that meals are awkward when people don't know each other and aren't sure of the rules. Mrs. Vance served beef stew and cornbread at the long kitchen table, and Pete Halloran and two ranch hands named Dell and Cooper ate at one end without talking much. Mercer sat at the head of the table. Evelyn and the girls sat along one side. Grace ate with the focus of a child who had not eaten a full meal in a while. Lily ate carefully and complimented Mrs. Vance on the cornbread, which seemed to surprise Mrs. Vance enough that she looked at Lily twice. Maggie ate with one eye on the room, cataloging. Mercer ate without talking for the first several minutes. He wasn't unfriendly. He just wasn't filling silence for the sake of filling it, which Evelyn recognized as a personality type that could go either way. Cooper, one of the ranch hands, was the one who finally said something. He was younger than the others, somewhere around 20, with the particular confidence of young men who haven't been embarrassed enough times yet. "So the girls will be doing what, Exactly, he said. Not rudely. He was asking Mercer, not Evelyn, which was its own kind of rude without meaning to be. Mercer said, "Whatever needs doing." "'Cause Pete was saying we could use someone in the whatever needs doing," Mercer said again, and something in his tone closed the subject without drama. Cooper went back to his stew. Evelyn, watching all of this, revised her estimate of Caleb Mercer slightly upward, not because he'd been warm about it, because he hadn't made a speech about it either. He'd just said the thing and meant it, and moved on. After supper, she stayed to help Mrs. Vance wash up. Mrs. Vance accepted the help without ceremony and handed her a towel. "You done ranch work before?" Mrs. Vance said after a while. "Farm work," Evelyn said. "We had a wheat farm and livestock some." Mrs. Vance nodded, scrubbing a pot. "Ranch is different." "I expect I'll learn." Mrs. Vance glanced at her sidelong. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He's not easy either, but he's not bad." "I didn't ask," Evelyn said. "No," Mrs. Vance said. "I know you didn't." They finished the dishes. She saw Mercer later that evening, by accident. She had gone outside. The girls were in bed, and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, and she needed air. And he was sitting on the front porch in one of the two chairs out there, not doing anything, just sitting. He had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he was looking out at the dark. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. He heard her and turned his head, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said, "Why did you do it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back out at the dark. "I had a wife," he said. "Rebecca. She died in '82, fever." He said it the way you say a thing you've said many times that's worn smooth from handling. "We had a boy. He was 2. He died with her." Evelyn said nothing. "I've been running this ranch alone since then," Mercer said. I'm not explaining something that isn't there. I just..." He stopped. Started again. "I watched that square fill up this morning, and I watched Harold Pruitt do his reasonable voice, and I watched those men standing there with their offers, and I thought about Rebecca, standing in a square." He shook his head. "I couldn't not. It was not a polished thing to say. It wasn't the declaration of a man who'd made a noble decision and wanted credit for it. It was the explanation of a man who'd done something because not doing it wasn't something he was capable of that morning, and he wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet." Evelyn stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Mercer." "Good night," he said. She went inside. She lay in the dark of the small plain room and listened to the ranch settle around her, the sounds of a place that had its own rhythms she didn't know yet, and thought about what he'd said, and thought about Rebecca, who she'd never know, and thought about Thomas in his green wheat field, and thought about her daughters in the next room, sleeping deeper than they had in weeks. The tension of the past months releasing itself in sleep the way children's bodies do. And the grief and the relief and the fury and the uncertainty were all present at once, which was not comfortable, but was at least honest. She had 4 years. 4 years to figure out what came next. She'd figure it out. In the first weeks, the ranch made its demands known without asking whether she was ready. She was up before 5 every morning, not because anyone ordered her to be, but because there was no version of herself that could lie in bed at 5 in the morning with work undone. She learned the kitchen garden from Mrs. Vance, who taught by doing rather than explaining. She learned which fences needed checking in which order, and how the water troughs worked, and where the supply shed kept things, and the particular temperament of the bay mare in the third stall, who did not like being approached from the left side. Maggie followed her like a shadow and asked questions that were usually better than the ones Evelyn had thought to ask. Pete Halloran started bringing his ledger books out to the kitchen table on Thursday evenings, initially because Mrs. Vance had told him to reorganize them, and he had no particular gift for organizing, and somehow, through some gravitational process that no one commented on, Maggie ended up sitting beside him, working through the columns. By the third Thursday, Pete was handing her the books and going to get coffee and coming back to find them corrected. He didn't say anything about it. He just kept bringing the books. Lily found the piano. It was in the front room, covered with a sheet, and nobody had mentioned it. Evelyn had assumed it was there as furniture. A lot of frontier households had pianos that nobody played anymore, leftovers of optimism. But she came downstairs one afternoon to the sound of something hesitant and careful coming from behind the closed door, and opened it to find Lily sitting at the uncovered keyboard playing a scale with one hand. She stopped when Evelyn appeared. "Was that there the whole time?" Evelyn said. Lily nodded. "Does it work?" "Mostly," Lily said. "3 keys stick. But mostly." Evelyn looked at the piano, a battered upright, clearly old but solid, and then at her daughter's face, which had the look of a child carefully not wanting something too loudly in case it got taken away. "Play something," Evelyn said. Lily played something small and careful, and then, when Evelyn didn't leave, something less small. By the time Evelyn went back to the kitchen, Lily was playing with both hands. She heard it from 3 rooms away and thought, "There she is. There's Lily again." Grace and Scout reached an understanding in the second week. It happened without ceremony. Grace had been leaving small scraps near where Scout slept, not approaching him, just leaving them and retreating. And Scout had been ignoring her with the pointed deliberateness of an animal making a decision. Then one morning, Evelyn came around the corner of the barn and found Scout sitting next to Grace, while Grace crouched beside him with her hand on his back, both of them looking at a field mouse that had appeared from somewhere. The mouse left. Grace and Scout continued sitting. Mercer had come around the same corner at the same moment, from the other side, and stopped the same way Evelyn did. He looked at Grace and Scout for a moment. "Huh," he said. "How long has he been yours?" Grace asked him, without looking up. 6 years, Mercer said. "Did you name him right away?" "No, he was just dog for a while." "Why'd you pick Scout?" Mercer considered this. He found the wolf trap that time, east pasture, found it before one of the horses stepped in it. Grace appeared to think this was sufficient. "Okay," she said. She stayed where she was. Scout stayed where he was. Mercer looked at Evelyn across the barn corner. Evelyn looked back. Neither of them said anything, which was the shape their conversations often had, one of them observing something, the other acknowledging it, and then both of them going back to work. But it was a different quality of silence than the first week. There were hard days. That needs to be said. There were mornings Evelyn woke up, and the grief hit her before she was fully conscious. Thomas, the farm, the life that was supposed to happen, and she lay there and let it sit on her chest for exactly long enough and then got up. There were evenings Lily sat at the piano and played something too slow and mournful, and then stopped and said she was tired when she wasn't tired, and Evelyn let that go too because there wasn't a thing to say that would help it. There was the day Maggie came in from the east pasture with a cut on her palm from a wire fence and sat at the table while Evelyn wrapped it and said quietly, in a voice Evelyn hadn't heard from her before, "I miss Papa." "I know," Evelyn said. "It's not like missing him gets less. It's just like I keep finding new parts of it." Evelyn looked at her daughter's 9-year-old face, saying 9-year-old words that were also completely true. "Yeah," she said, "that's what it is." She wrapped the hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary, and Maggie let her. There was also the afternoon Pete Halloran came to find Evelyn in the garden with his hat in his hands and said that 2 of the ranch hands from the South Pasture crew had been complaining, not loudly, not to Mercer, but to each other and in earshot of Pete, about a woman giving orders, about children underfoot, about the situation. "Which ones?" Evelyn asked. "Dell and Cooper." She thought about Cooper from the first supper. She'd been right about the not embarrassed enough yet assessment. "What do you want me to do about it?" Pete said. He was not unfriendly about it. He was genuinely asking. "Nothing," she said. "It's not your problem. I'll handle it." She found Dell and Cooper the next morning repairing a section of fence on the western line and said, without introduction, "I hear there's been talk about me and my daughters." Both men looked at her. Cooper had the grace to look somewhat caught. Dell was older, harder to read. "I'm not here to argue about it," she said. "I'm here to say that I don't make decisions I don't understand, and I don't give direction on things I haven't learned. If you've got a problem with the way something's being done, you tell me to my face and I'll listen. If you've got a problem with me being here at all," she paused, "that's between you and Mr. Mercer." She left them with the fence. She heard later from Mrs. Vance that Dell had said something to Pete about the Carter woman not being as soft as she looked, which, in the language of ranch hands, was apparently close to a compliment. What? Mercer heard about the fence conversation. She didn't know who told him. Pete, probably. But one evening he was out on the porch when she went past and he said, "You didn't need to do that yourself." "I know," she said. "I would have handled it." "I know that too," she said. She kept walking. Then she stopped and turned back. He was watching her from the porch with the gray eyes and the unreadable expression. "I need to handle things myself," she said. "Not because you can't, because I need to know I still can." She paused. "I stopped knowing that for a while. I don't want to stop knowing it again." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. Not agreement exactly, more like he'd placed the information where it needed to go. "All right," he said. She went on. Behind her, she heard the creak of the porch boards as he settled back in his chair, and the distant sound of Lily playing piano drifting through an open window, and Grace talking to Scout in the low, earnest voice she used when she thought no one was listening, and the sun going down over Kansas in its usual spectacular and indifferent way. And none of it was the life she'd planned, and all of it was real. She'd been here 6 weeks, 3 years and 46 weeks to go. She went back inside. The autumn came the way it always did in Kansas. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door swinging open. One morning, the light was different. The air had a new weight to it, and the cottonwoods along the creek started letting go of their leaves in long, drifting sheets of yellow. Evelyn noticed it from the kitchen window while she was starting the coffee, and something in the shift of the season made the 6 weeks behind her feel longer than they were, and the time ahead feel less abstract. She had stopped counting days somewhere around week 4. She hadn't decided to stop. She just noticed one afternoon that she'd lost track of the specific number and hadn't immediately tried to recover it, and that fact told her something she wasn't entirely sure how to name. The work had settled into shape around them. Mornings she was in the kitchen garden or helping Mrs. Vance with preserving. They had a full season's worth of tomatoes and beans and squash that needed putting up before the frost came. An afternoon she'd taken over the household accounts, which had been kept in a ledger that Mrs. Vance managed with the same practical authority she applied to everything, but which had accumulated 6 months of small errors that nobody had caught. Evelyn found them in the first week and corrected them without saying anything about it, just handed the ledger back with a note about the discrepancies. Mrs. Vance had looked at the note, looked at Evelyn, and said nothing. But the following week she'd handed the ledger directly to Evelyn without being asked. That was the closest thing to a compliment Mrs. Vance offered, and Evelyn understood it as such. Maggie was in the barn more than the house by that point, a development that had happened in increments too small to object to. It had started with the ledger work with Pete, which had expanded into conversations about supply orders and herd numbers. The kind of conversations Pete was surprised to find himself having with a 9-year-old until he stopped being surprised and started just having them. Then one morning, Maggie had gone out with him to help count the cattle in the north pasture, and come back with her boots dirty and her eyes alive in a way Evelyn hadn't seen since before Thomas died. "The north herd is short by 4, Maggie told her at supper. "Pete thinks they went through the fence near the creek. He said we'll ride out and check tomorrow." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "We?" Maggie looked back steadily. "He said I could come." Evelyn looked at Pete across the table. Pete had the expression of a man who was aware he might have made a unilateral decision that wasn't his to make. "She's got a head for it," Pete said. It was not exactly an apology. It was also clearly as close as Pete came to advocacy. Evelyn said, "Wear your heavy coat. Mornings are cold now." Maggie said, "I know, Mama." She went the next morning and came back with 4 cattle accounted for and more mud on her coat than Evelyn wanted to think about, and the quiet, satisfied look of someone who'd done something real. Caleb Mercer watched all of this without commenting. That was his way. He observed things, processed them somewhere internal, and occasionally said something about them much later when you'd almost forgotten the original event. He was a man who didn't narrate his own thinking, which Evelyn had come to understand as neither aloofness nor mystery. It was just how he was built. Some people talked to figure out what they thought. Mercer thought first and talked when he was done. She'd learned to read the silences better than she would have expected, There was a silence when he saw Maggie's mud-caked coat on the porch railing that said he wasn't displeased. There was a silence at the piano one evening when Lily played something she'd composed herself. Not a song Evelyn recognized, something Lily had been working out in pieces over the past weeks. And he stood in the doorway of the front room listening with his arms folded and his coffee cup forgotten in his hand until Lily finished. And then he said, "You write that yourself?" And when Lily said yes, he nodded once and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Lily looked at Evelyn after he left with an expression that said, "Was that good?" Evelyn said, "Yes." Lily played it again. The trouble started in October. Evelyn felt it coming before she knew the shape of it. A visitor to Red Creek whom Pete mentioned in passing, a name she didn't immediately register until later that night, when something nagged at her enough to make her ask. "Who came through town?" she said the next morning, catching Pete in the yard. "Fella named Pruitt," Pete said with no particular inflection. He was tightening a harness and didn't look up. "Asking around about Mercer's place." The name sat in her stomach like a stone. "What kind of asking around?" she said. Pete set down the harness. He looked at her now. "The kind where you don't tell people you're asking. The kind where you talk to the bank and the county office and 3 ranchers at the saloon, but you don't go to the man directly." He paused. "I heard from Darnell at the livery. Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you," she said. She found Mercer in the far barn doing something with a length of rope and a pulley that she didn't interrupt. She waited until he registered her presence and looked up. "Harold Pruitt is in Red Creek," she said. Mercer set the rope down. His expression didn't change much, that same stillness, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. "When?" "Yesterday. He left, I think, but Pete says he was asking about you, about the ranch." She hesitated. "He's not done with us. I didn't think he would be." Mercer picked up the rope again, turned it over in his hands. "What does he want?" "Money, originally. He lost whatever he thought he'd get from the contracts. But Harold Pruitt doesn't just want money. He wants to not be embarrassed. He wants to win." She'd had 12 years to observe people's motivations, and Harold Pruitt had been among the least complicated. He wanted things to go the way he said they would. "He'll find a way to make this about something other than what it actually is." Mercer looked at her. "You know him." "Well enough." "Then what's his move?" Evelyn thought. "He'll find a legal angle. He's not a man who does things outside the law. He likes the law because he's good at using it. He'll find something in the contract or something about how you—" She stopped. "How you obtained us. Whether there was coercion or whether you had the authority." "It was a legal contract," Mercer said. "I know that. Harold knows that too. That doesn't mean he can't make it look like something else to someone who doesn't." Mercer put the rope down again and looked at the middle distance for a moment. It was the look he had when he was working through something. "All right," he said. "All right what?" she said. "All right, I hear you." He looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend I've dealt with this kind of thing before. I'm a rancher. I know cattle and land and weather, and I know this county reasonably well, but I don't know legal fights." "Neither do I," she said. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together." It was the first time he'd used that word, together, and it landed differently than she expected. Not sentimentally, more like a gear clicking into place. "I'll write to my brother in Wichita," he said. "He knows a lawyer. I've been meaning to for other reasons. Now I have a specific one." "Good," she said. She went back to the house. On the way, she passed Grace sitting on the fence of the near pasture with Scout beside her, watching 2 of the young horses run the perimeter. Grace was talking to them in the low, earnest voice she used, and one of the horses, the gray one, Ember, who had been skittish since they arrived, had slowed from its full run to a trot at the near fence and was moving along it in the same direction as Grace's voice. Evelyn stopped and watched for a moment. Grace didn't notice her. Ember slowed further, blowing air, coming toward the fence in steps that were still nervous but less so. She'd ask Mercer about it later. Whether Grace could spend more time with the horses, specifically, whether Pete would mind. But right now she had other things to think about. Harold Pruitt's next move arrived not as a visit, but as paperwork. delivered to Twin Pines Ranch on a gray Tuesday by a county official named Whitmore, who had the manner of a man who deeply preferred to be somewhere else. He handed the documents to Mercer at the door, said the words he was required to say, and left before anyone thought to offer him coffee. Mercer read the papers at the kitchen table. Evelyn read them over his shoulder because she wasn't going to wait for him to summarize. The language was careful, and the argument was simple, which meant someone had thought about it. Harold Pruitt had filed a complaint with the state office in Topeka, alleging that the labor contract transfer had occurred under financial duress on his part, that Caleb Mercer had used his standing in the community to pressure a financially vulnerable man into an unfair transfer, and that the welfare of the minor children, Maggie, Lily, and Grace Carter, could not be properly assessed under the current arrangement. The state was requesting an inquiry. The county was required to respond. A hearing was being set for November. There was also a secondary document attached, which had language about the temporary transfer of the minors to state care pending the outcome of the inquiry and Evelyn's return to her legal guardian's authority, which was still Harold Pruitt until a court said otherwise. She read that sentence twice. Then she set the papers down. Mrs. Vance was at the stove and had not turned around during any of this, but her stirring had stopped. Pete was in the doorway from the back hall, where he'd appeared sometime during the reading. Evelyn said, "He wants the girls put in state custody." The words sounded different out loud than they had on the page, more real, more specific. Mercer said, "That's not happening." It wasn't bravado. He said it the way he said things he'd already decided, flat and factual. "The paper says," she started. "I know what the paper says," he said. "I'm telling you what's happening." He looked at her. "We fight it. That's what I said before, and that's what I mean. Get a lawyer, build a case, stand in that courtroom. I'm not sending your children anywhere." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without flinching, not performing steadiness, just actually being it, which she'd come to understand was the only version of it he had. "Your brother's lawyer," she said. "How long to get him here?" "Right today. He could be here in 2 weeks." 2 weeks is enough time to prepare," she said. She looked at Pete. Who in Red Creek would speak for Caleb's character? Honestly, not just because they owe him. Pete thought about it. Doc Harrell, Margaret Ostrowski at the dry goods, old Whitfield out past the South Road. He and Caleb have had their run-ins, but he's honest. People who don't love him but respect him, she said. That's better than people who'll sound like they're paid to say it. Jim Harrell and Whitfield both have reasons to dislike me, Mercer said. Whitfield especially. Good, Evelyn said. A man who'd speak for you even when he's got cause not to. That's the one the court will believe. Mercer looked at her with an expression that was hard to name. Not quite surprised, more like he was revising something. You've thought about this before, he said. I've thought about everything before, she said. I've had a lot of nights with nothing else to do. The letter went to Wichita that afternoon. While they waited, Evelyn began her own preparation. She was not a lawyer, and she knew it. What she was a woman who had spent 12 years managing a household on insufficient information and making it work, and who had a very precise memory for detail. She started writing things down, everything she could document about the past 6 weeks at Twin Pines. Not feelings, not impressions, but specifics, dates, tasks, what each of her daughters had been doing and with whose knowledge. The ledger corrections, with dates. Maggie's work with Pete, which Pete agreed to write out in his own hand and sign. Lily's piano composition, which Lily could perform in person if it came to that. Grace and the Horses, which Mercer wrote up himself in 2 pages of very plain, very direct language that said more by its plainness than a longer statement would have. She also wrote her own account. She started from the farm, from Thomas's death, from the first creditor on the porch. She wrote Harold Pruitt's offer, and what he'd said in the kitchen, and what she'd understood him to mean. She wrote the auction, and what was said there, who said it, in what order, with what words. Because she'd been standing on those steps with nothing to do but listen, and she had listened very carefully. She wrote for 3 evenings in a row, at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed. Mercer came through twice and saw her writing and didn't ask. He made coffee and left a cup near her without comment, which she appreciated for its uncomplicated practicality. On the 3rd evening, he sat down across the table from her. You going to sleep? He said. When I'm done. How much more is there? Some. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what you're putting in there, the auction, Pruitt, all of it. You understand that's going to be public if it goes to a courtroom. I know. People in this town knowing your business. Mr. Mercer, she said. She looked up from the paper. This town watched me stand on courthouse steps with my 3 daughters while men put bids on us. There's not much left to protect. He accepted that. The silence between them settled, not awkwardly. It had stopped being awkward sometime in the past month, she'd noticed, replaced by something that was more like the silence between people who are separately focused on the same problem. What do you know about Harold's finances? He said after a while. He has debts. I don't know specifics, but the way he moved, taking us in, the conversation in the kitchen, the speed of setting up the auction, he needed cash quickly. People who need cash quickly usually have something that requires it. I could ask around. Carefully, she said. If he hears we're looking, he'll move faster. I know how to ask around carefully, Mercer said. She believed him. He was not a man who made things bigger than they needed to be. All right, she said. She went back to her writing. He got up and put his coffee cup in the wash basin and went upstairs. She heard his footsteps overhead, measured and deliberate, and then the quiet of the house at night, and the scratch of her pen on paper, and the wind outside that had picked up cold and was moving through the cottonwoods in long, sighing passes. Oh, the lawyer's name was Edmund Ware. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a leather satchel, a serious face, and the kind of focused attention that told you he'd read the letter more than once. He was somewhere in his late 40s, heavy-set, with spectacles he took off and cleaned when he was thinking and put back on when he'd decided something. He sat at the kitchen table and read Evelyn's written account without interruption, which took 40 minutes. Then he read Mercer's statement, then Pete's, then he cleaned his spectacles. How old are the children? He said. Maggie is 9, Lily 8, Grace 7, Evelyn said. The youngest 2 are too young to give testimony that carries much weight. Maggie is borderline. He looked at her over the spectacles. But the court is going to want to see the children. They'll be there, Evelyn said. Mrs. Carter, this is a state inquiry, which means the bar isn't just showing that Mr. Mercer is a decent man. The bar is showing that the process by which these children came to be in his care was not exploitative, that they're thriving rather than suffering, and, he paused, that the alternative arrangement proposed by Mr. Pruitt is worse for the children than the current one. It is, Evelyn said. I believe you. The court needs to believe it. Then we show them, she said. That's what the documentation is for. Edmund Ware looked at her documentation again. Where did you learn to do this? I ran a household for 12 years with not enough money and wrote down everything that was spent and everything that happened so I could account for it, she said. I've been accounting for things my whole life. He looked at her for a moment longer than felt strictly professional, not rudely, more like reassessing. All right, he said. Then let's talk strategy. Boy, what followed were 2 weeks of a specific kind of work that Evelyn hadn't done before but understood immediately. The work of building an argument, which was not unlike building anything else. You started with what was true, you found the materials that demonstrated it, and you assembled them in an order that made the truth visible to someone who hadn't been there to see it happen. Ware spoke to Doc Harrell, who had treated Lily for a minor cold 2 weeks into their arrival, and could testify to her general health and the care being taken. He spoke to Margaret Ostrowski, who'd seen Evelyn in the dry goods store and could speak to the children's appearance and demeanor. He rode out to speak to Whitfield, the rancher who had ongoing boundary disagreements with Mercer, and came back saying Whitfield was cantankerous and difficult and had agreed to testify anyway. Mercer's asking around about Harold's finances produced something useful. Harold Pruitt had borrowed heavily from a land speculation partner named Dorset, who had interests in a proposed railway route that ran through the eastern quarter of the county. There were parcels of land Harold had optioned through the arrangement, and there were questions about whether some of those options were legitimate. It wasn't the kind of thing that directly contradicted Harold's claims in the inquiry, but it was the kind of thing that painted a picture of a man whose financial decisions were being driven by pressure, which went to motive. Can we use it? Evelyn asked Ware. Not directly, Ware said. But if Pruitt takes the stand and presents himself as a man acting purely out of concern for these children, and I have information that suggests his concerns are somewhat more financial in nature, then yes, we can use it. Evelyn wrote 3 more pages that night. The hearing was 2 weeks away when Harold Pruitt came to the ranch. She didn't know he was coming. Neither did Mercer, which meant neither of them had time to prepare, which was probably the point. She was in the kitchen garden cutting the last of the autumn kale when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see Harold's buggy coming down the drive, and she stood there with dirt on her hands and a knife in her apron pocket and watched him pull up to the front of the house. He got down from the buggy and saw her. "Evelyn," he said. The voice was the same, reasonable, patient. He was wearing his good coat. He had the look of a man who'd planned this visit carefully. "Harold," she said. He walked across the yard toward her. His eyes went briefly to her hands, the garden, the house, and she could see him cataloging it, not appraising exactly, more confirming something he'd already decided. "I'd like to talk," he said. "Reasonably, before this goes further. We have a hearing scheduled," she said. "Talk to Edmund Ware." "I'm not interested in lawyers and hearings," Harold said. "I'm interested in resolving this quietly, the way it should have been handled from the start." He paused. "The inquiry doesn't have to proceed. If you come back, you and the girls, and we settle the original contract arrangement appropriately, I withdraw the complaint and everyone goes on with their lives." She looked at him. His face had the same measured patience it always had, and underneath it she could see something else now that she hadn't been able to see before. Not malice exactly, more a kind of fundamental incapability of understanding that what he'd done was wrong. He had genuinely organized this in his mind as a reasonable business matter that had gone sideways, and he was now making a reasonable offer to correct it. "No," she said. Harold's expression shifted. The patience was still there, but something tightened underneath it. "Evelyn, think carefully. The hearing—" "I've thought about it," she said. "My answer is no. The court could rule against you. The children could be placed in—" "I know what the papers say," she said. "I drafted my own." He looked at her for a moment. She saw him trying to find the version of this conversation where her refusal was temporary, where he could say the right thing to move her back to the position he needed. "You're not being rational," he said. And she heard in it now what she'd missed when she was frightened. This was what he always said when people didn't give him what he wanted. Rational meant agreeable. Irrational meant no. "I'm being very rational," she said. "I have a lawyer. I have documentation. I have witnesses. And I have 3 daughters who sleep through the night for the first time since you put us on those courthouse steps." She held his look. "Get off this property, Harold. Talk to Edmund Ware if you have something else to say." Harold looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the house, the garden, the barn in the distance, and the ranch that surrounded all of it. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said. He got back in his buggy and left. Evelyn stood in the garden with her dirty hands and watched the buggy go down the drive and out onto the road and diminish toward town. Then she turned and found Mercer standing at the corner of the house. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough," he said. She nodded. She went back to the kale. After a moment, she heard him go back toward the barn, his footsteps on the hard November ground, and then the familiar sounds of the ranch going on around her. And she stayed in the garden until the cold drove her inside because she needed the air and the space to let her hands stop shaking. They'd been shaking since Harold pulled into the drive. She hadn't let them show. But they'd been shaking. She told Ware about the visit that evening. Ware was not happy. "He came to the ranch directly?" Ware said. "He offered to withdraw the complaint if we came back to him," she said. "I said no." Ware cleaned his spectacles, put them back, took them off again. That's actually useful. If he's offering to withdraw, it suggests he's not certain of the outcome. And if you have witnesses to the offer—" "Mercer heard most of it," she said. "Good." Ware was making notes. "It also speaks to motive. He's not conducting this inquiry because he genuinely believes those children are in danger. He's conducting it because he wants the contract back, or at minimum, he wants to demonstrate that he has power in this situation." He looked at her. "We document the visit. We document the offer. We document your refusal. I've already started, she said. Ware almost smiled. You know, most clients I have to drag through this process. I've had to drag myself through worse, she said. The night before the hearing, Evelyn sat in the chair by the window of the small plain room and looked out at the November dark. The ranch was quiet. Her daughters were asleep. Grace had gone out like a lamp the moment her head hit the pillow. Lily had read for a while with the small oil lamp and then gone quiet. Maggie had lain awake longer than the others, the way she did on nights when she was thinking, and had finally settled sometime around 10. Evelyn had not settled. She wasn't afraid exactly. She'd passed through fear into something on the other side of it, a state where the outcome was still uncertain, but her own position in relation to it had become clear. She knew what she was going to say. She knew what she'd documented. She knew where was good, and the witnesses were honest, and the children were demonstrably, visibly, undeniably better than they had been. She also knew that courts in 1887 did not always respond to demonstrable, visible truth. She knew that a man with Harold Pruitt's patience and Harold Pruitt's understanding of legal language was not nothing. She knew the inquiry had been filed with the state, and the state had its own processes, and those processes were not always on the side of the person who was right. She knew all of that. She was still going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and say every word she'd prepared, and mean every one of them. Downstairs she heard a door, and then the sound she'd come to recognize as Mercer not sleeping either. The floorboard in the kitchen that creaked when he went to get the coffee he didn't need. The sound of the back door opening and closing as he went out to the porch. The same thing he'd been doing for weeks when something kept him awake. She thought about going down. She thought about it for a few minutes, which was longer than she usually thought about things. Then she got up, put on her boots and her coat, and went downstairs. He was in the porch chair with a coffee cup and the dark around him, same as the first night. He heard her and looked, and she came and stood by the railing rather than taking the other chair, because this wasn't the same as before, and she didn't want to pretend it was. "Can't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. She looked out at the dark. The stars were very clear and very cold and very far away, which was comforting in a way she couldn't have explained. Something about how they'd been there longer than any of this and would be there after. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped, finding the words. "What you did at that auction, I know I didn't say thank you. I didn't want to say thank you, and I still don't want to say it the way it usually gets said, like you did something generous and I owe you for the generosity. But," she paused again, "you were the only person who looked at us like we were people, and that mattered. Whatever happens tomorrow, that mattered." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Rebecca would have done the same thing," he said. "Faster than I did, probably." He looked at the dark. "I stood there for a long time before I said anything. I'm not proud of that." "You said it," she said. "Eventually." "Sometimes eventually is all you get," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The wind moved the cottonwoods at the edge of the property, and the stars kept doing what stars do. And the ranch was quiet and dark and solid around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was all right. She went back inside when the cold got through her coat. He stayed. In the morning, they would drive to Red Creek and stand in the courthouse and fight for the right to keep what they'd built here, which wasn't much yet. 6 weeks, 3 children, a dog who'd made a decision about Grace, a piano with 3 stuck keys, a ledger that balanced now, but was theirs, which counted for more than Evelyn had known how to say on the night she arrived. She went up the stairs. She looked in on her daughters, sleeping all 3 in their ordinary way. Grace flat on her back with her arms out, Lily curled tight, Maggie on her side with one hand under her cheek, like she was always thinking even in her sleep. She stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long time. Then she went back to her own room and lay down on the hard bed and closed her eyes and waited for morning, which came, the way mornings do, whether you're ready for it or not. The morning of the hearing came in cold and gray, the kind of November sky that didn't bother pretending to be anything other than what it was. Evelyn had been up since 4:30. Not anxious exactly. She'd moved past anxious sometime in the night, more like a body that understood something important was happening and had decided sleep was a secondary concern. She had the girls dressed and fed by 7. Mrs. Vance made oatmeal and didn't say much, which was her version of support, and Evelyn accepted it the way she accepted most things from Mrs. Vance. without ceremony and with genuine appreciation. Pete ate standing up, which he always did when he was unsettled, and managed to communicate through the angle of his shoulders that he would be there if needed without saying a single word about it. Mercer came down at 6:45 in his good coat, which she'd seen him wear exactly once before, the day Edmund Ware arrived. He had shaved carefully, which was a thing she noticed because it changed his face enough to make her look twice. He caught her looking and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup. The kitchen had the sound of a household moving through something. Not quite normal morning, but not yet what was coming. Lily sat at the table eating her oatmeal slowly, watching her spoon. Grace had given Scout an extra piece of cornbread under the table, which everyone saw and no one commented on. Maggie was the only one who was fully ready before she needed to be, sitting straight in her chair with her hands in her lap and the look of someone rehearsing. Evelyn went to her. She crouched down in front of Maggie's chair. "You don't have to say anything today," Evelyn said. "I know," Maggie said. "Ware said the girls might be asked a few questions, simple ones. You can answer simply." "I know, Mama." "If someone asks you something you don't understand, you say you don't understand." Maggie looked at her with a patience that was startling in a 9-year-old. "Mama, I know." Evelyn put her hand on Maggie's cheek for a moment. Maggie let her. The courthouse in Red Creek was a single large room with wooden benches and tall, narrow windows that let in the gray November light in long, pale strips. The judge's bench was at the front, raised enough to be authoritative, not so high as to be theatrical. The room smelled of sawdust and old paper, and the specific staleness of a building used for official purposes. It was already half full when they arrived. Evelyn had not expected that. She understood in an abstract way that this was a public proceeding, that people in small frontier towns had a limited number of entertainments, but the actual sight of 30 or 40 people settling onto benches and talking in low voices while Harold Pruitt sat at one table with a man she didn't recognize, his lawyer, presumably, younger and sharper looking than Ware, hit her differently than she'd prepared for. She kept walking. She did not look around at the faces. Ware was already at the other table, his papers spread, his spectacles in place. He looked up when they came in and gave a single nod that meant, "We're ready." Mercer sat beside Ware. Evelyn sat beside Mercer. The girls sat in the front bench immediately behind, with Pete beside them, which had been arranged in advance without much discussion. Pete had simply said he'd be there, and no one had told him otherwise. Harold Pruitt was across the room, and she could see him in her peripheral vision. He did not look at her. He was talking in low tones to his lawyer, a man who had the name Aldous Fitch written on the paper Ware had shown her. Topeka trained, which meant Harold had spent money on this. She filed that away. A man spending money on a Topeka lawyer to fight for the return of a labor contract that wasn't worth the cost of the lawyer, which meant this wasn't about money at all, in the end. This was about Harold Pruitt not losing. Judge Elias Crandall entered at 9 o'clock sharp, and the room went quiet. He was older than Evelyn had expected, somewhere in his late 60s, compact, with white hair and the deliberate movements of a man who had been making consequential decisions for a long time and had stopped being hurried by other people's urgency. He sat, arranged his papers, looked at the room over his spectacles. "We're here on the matter of the inquiry filed by Harold Pruitt regarding the Carter family labor contracts and the welfare of the minor children," he said. His voice carried without effort. "This is an inquiry, not a full trial. We're here to determine whether the children's current placement is appropriate and whether the transfer of the contract was conducted lawfully. Mr. Fitch, your client's complaint." Aldous Fitch stood. He was good. Evelyn watched him the way she'd watch anyone she needed to understand quickly, cataloging, confident but not showy, organized, the kind of lawyer who made complex things sound simple and simple things sound inevitable. He laid out Harold's complaint in 15 minutes, hitting the key points without overloading them. The transfer was conducted in haste. Caleb Mercer was a man of significant local influence, and Harold Pruitt was a man in financial difficulty, which Fitch framed not as Harold's failing, but as vulnerability that could be exploited. The children were placed in the care of an unmarried man running a working ranch with minimal domestic arrangements. State law had clear standards for the welfare of minor children. He was careful not to accuse Mercer of anything specific. He didn't need to. He just kept using words like unclear and concerning and without adequate inquiry until the air in the room had a slightly different quality than it had before he started. Evelyn wrote 3 words on the paper in front of her. Financial vulnerability, his. Ware saw it. He nodded fractionally. Ware opened with Caleb Mercer, which was the decision they'd made together. Establish the man before you establish the facts, because the court needed to see who Mercer was before it could assess what he'd done. Mercer took the stand with the same manner he had everywhere, deliberate, unembellished, present. He answered Ware's questions in plain sentences and didn't expand unless asked to. He described the auction, why he'd attended, what he'd observed, what he'd decided, and why. He described the arrangement at Twin Pines, the rooms, the work, the pay that was going against the contract, the conditions the family lived under. Fitch cross-examined him for 20 minutes. He was looking for cracks in the plainness, trying to find a place where Mercer's manner would read as either arrogance or evasion. He asked about Mercer's relationship to the county officials who'd overseen the auction. He asked whether Mercer had spoken to Harold Pruitt before the auction. He asked about the specific terms of the financial arrangement. Mercer answered everything in the same tone, no more, no less. At one point, Fitch said, "Mr. Mercer, would you characterize your influence in this county as considerable?" Mercer said, "I'd characterize it as what comes from being here for 20 years and doing what I said I would do." Fitch paused, moved on. After Mercer, Ware called Pete Halloran. Pete on a witness stand was Pete in the barn, plain-spoken past the point of comfort, unwilling to elaborate on things he didn't think needed elaborating, occasionally so direct that it bordered on difficult. Fitch tried to establish that the children's presence on the ranch was more burden than flourishing, and Pete said, with the expression of a man hearing something that didn't match any reality he'd observed, "The older girl's been helping me run the supply numbers since her 3rd week. She found an ordering error I'd been making for 2 years. There was a sound from somewhere in the benches. Not laughter, more like the involuntary noise a room makes when something lands." Fitch let Pete go. Doc Harrell was brief and professional. He described Lily's cold, the children's general health, the conditions of the household. Fitch did not cross-examine him much. A doctor's testimony about children's physical health was difficult to attack without looking like you were attacking the children's health. Then Ware called Margaret Ostrowski. She was a small woman, somewhere in her 60s, who had run the dry goods store in Red Creek for 30 years and had the particular authority of someone who'd seen everyone in the county at their worst and kept their own counsel about it. She sat in the stand like she sat in her own store, comfortable, unimpressed by the setting. She said she'd seen Evelyn Carter in her store on 4 occasions since October. She said she'd seen the children twice. She said that in her observation, and she said observation with a weight that made it clear she took the word seriously, the children did not have the manner of children who were suffering. Fitch, cross-examining, said, "And how would you characterize the manner of children who are suffering, Mrs. Ostrowski?" She looked at him. "Small," she said. "They get small. They stop asking for things. They stop looking at people directly." She paused. "The middle girl, Lily, she spent 10 minutes in my store looking at the sheet music I carry. It's not much, just what I can get, but she looked at every page." She folded her hands. "Children who are suffering don't look at sheet music for 10 minutes. Fitch said, "That's an impression, not a fact." Margaret Ostrowski looked at him with 30 years of observing people in her eyes. "Everything about human beings is an impression," she said. "The question is whether your impression is worth anything." Ware did not try to hide that he was pleased. Whitfield came last in the morning session. He was a big man, 60s, weathered past the point of caring how he looked in a courtroom, and he sat in the stand with his hat in his lap and his jaw set in a way that suggested he was already annoyed about being there. Ware asked him to describe his relationship with Caleb Mercer. Whitfield said, "Contentious." The room shifted. Ware, with the practiced air of a man who'd prepared this exactly. "Can you be more specific?" "We've had 3 boundary disputes in 15 years, Whitfield said. "One of them went to mediation and Mercer won it, and I thought he was wrong. And I still think he was wrong." He paused. "He was also right, technically, which is the part that bothered me." And despite that history, you agreed to testify on his behalf? Whitfield looked at Ware. Then he looked at the room, at Harold Pruitt's table, at the benches full of people. I came because what I saw on that auction block in August was wrong, he said. And I don't care whose business it is. What was done to that woman and those girls was wrong. Mercer was the only one who did something about it. He paused. I wouldn't say that if it wasn't true. I've got no particular motivation to do Caleb Mercer any favors. Fitch chose not to cross-examine. The afternoon session was Evelyn. She'd known it was coming. She'd written everything down and gone over it with Ware 3 times, and knew the sequence of what she was going to say, and the specific details she was going to include, and the things she was going to let Fitch try to find holes in because she'd filled the holes in advance. She knew all of that. She still had to breathe carefully in the moment before Ware said her name. She took the stand. She looked out at the room, the benches, the faces she mostly didn't know, the gray November light coming through the narrow windows, Harold Pruitt's careful, patient expression at his table, her daughters in the front bench with Pete, Mercer at the table with Ware. And she thought about what she'd decided on the porch the night before Thomas died, a version of the same decision she'd been making over and over, that she was going to face the thing in front of her without folding. She answered Ware's opening questions in a clear voice and did not perform emotion she didn't feel. He walked her through the farm, Thomas's death, the creditors, Harold's letter. He walked her through the kitchen conversation, the one where Harold had stood in the doorway and talked to her back and said the word contract arrangement, and she repeated it as precisely as she could remember because she had written it down the same night it happened. She walked through the auction. She described standing on the courthouse steps, the bids that had been made, the heavy-set rancher's offer for Evelyn and the 2 older girls, the specific phrase old enough to work, the separate bid for Lily and Grace. She said these things in a steady voice and watched the room receive them. She heard someone in the benches make a sound that was not comfortable, and she didn't look to see who. She described Harold's visit to Twin Pines, the offer he'd made, the words he'd used. She had written those down the same afternoon before the memory could soften. Ware said, "And what was your response to Mr. Pruitt's offer to withdraw the complaint if you and your children returned to his custody?" "No," she said. "Can you elaborate on your reasoning?" She looked at the judge. Crandall had been watching her with the steady attention of a man who'd decided early on to actually listen, which she'd noticed and appreciated. "My daughters sleep through the night," she said. "They didn't before. Maggie has learned things about running a ranch operation that she'll use for the rest of her life. Lily is composing music. Grace has a gift with animals that I couldn't have predicted, and there's room for it to grow on that ranch." She paused. "I came to Twin Pines with nothing and with no reason to trust anyone. What I found there was work, and fair terms, and people who treated my children like people. I have no interest in undoing that." She looked at Harold across the room. He was looking back with the patient expression. She held it. "Mr. Pruitt offered me a chance to resolve this quietly," she said. "I said no because quiet is not the same as right. What was done to my family deserves to be said in a room full of people, with the court listening. Because if it can be done to us, it can be done to anyone." The room was very still. Fitch took his time standing up. He was good enough to not show that the morning had gone the way it had, which Evelyn respected even while she braced for what was coming. He said, "Mrs. Carter, you've described your husband's financial situation at the time of his death. Is it accurate that the farm was mortgaged significantly beyond its value?" "Yes," she said. "And that there were additional debts to creditors?" "Yes. So the family was, at the time you arrived in Red Creek, genuinely in significant debt?" "Yes. And Mr. Pruitt's arrangement was, in the legal sense, a legitimate response to that debt situation." Ware said, "Objection. I'll rephrase," Fitch said. "Mrs. Carter, you've characterized the auction as wrong, but labor contracts as a mechanism for debt settlement are legal in this state. Is that correct?" "Legal and right aren't the same thing," she said. "That's not what I asked." "They're legal," she said. "Yes. So your characterization of what happened as wrong is a moral argument, not a legal one." She looked at him. "I'd say that moral arguments are exactly what courts are for, when the law permits things that a room full of people knows are wrong." She paused. But since you're asking about legal, the complaint Mr. Pruitt filed says the contract transfer to Mr. Mercer was coercive. That's a legal claim, not a moral one. I'd like to talk about that. Fitch had not quite expected her to redirect. Where, she could see in her peripheral vision, had gone very still in the way that meant he was paying close attention. Fitch said, "Go ahead." Mr. Pruitt's complaint says Mr. Mercer used his local influence to pressure a financially vulnerable man, she said. But the vulnerable person in that square was me. I had no legal standing, I had no representation. The auction was proceeding regardless of what I thought or wanted. Mr. Mercer made an offer that was accepted. He didn't pressure Harold Pruitt into anything. Harold Pruitt had organized the entire event. He was the one with the papers. He was the one with the plan. She paused. The only unusual thing Caleb Mercer did was buy all four of us together, which Harold hadn't expected, and which meant Harold got less than he'd planned on. She let that settle. That's the coercion. Harold Pruitt didn't get what he wanted. That's the whole complaint. The room was not still this time. There was a murmur that moved through the benches like the sound the cottonwoods made in wind. Fitch stood for a moment. Then, "You seem very confident, Mrs. Carter." "I am," she said. "I have the documentation." The girls were called in the mid-afternoon, which Evelyn had expected and dreaded in roughly equal measure. Crandall had called a short recess before it, which was either consideration or procedure. She couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. She went to the front bench and sat with her daughters for the 15 minutes of the break. Pete stood nearby with his arms folded and said nothing, which was the right thing. "It's going to be Judge Crandall asking," she said. "Not Mr. Fitch or Mr. Ware. He just wants to talk to you." "What does he want to know?" Lily said. "How you are," Evelyn said. "How things are at the ranch." Lily said, "I can tell him about the piano." "If he asks about it, yes." Grace said, "Can I tell him about Scout?" "Grace, he asked about how things are," Grace said, with a logic that was unimpeachable if somewhat beside the point. Across the room, Evelyn could see Harold speaking quietly to Fitch, and something in Harold's posture was different than it had been in the morning, less settled. He'd expected the morning to go better than it had. She could read it in the way he held his shoulders. Good, she thought. Let him be unsettled. Crandall called Maggie first. Maggie walked to the stand with a steadiness that made Evelyn's chest do something uncomfortable. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at the judge with the focused attention she gave things she was trying to figure out. Crandall said, in a tone that was noticeably less formal than it had been all morning, "You're Maggie Carter." "Yes, sir," Maggie said. 9 years old. "Yes, sir." "And you've been living at Twin Pines Ranch since August." "Since the end of August," Maggie said. "It'll be 3 months next week." Crandall looked at her for a moment. "What do you do there?" Maggie considered this with the seriousness she gave most questions. "I helped Mr. Halloran with the supply ledgers. We had some error patterns in the ordering that were costing more than they needed to, and we've been fixing them. And I help count the North herd when Mr. Halloran needs another set of eyes." She paused. "I also do the regular household things, chores and helping Mama." Crandall said, "Do you want to stay at Twin Pines?" Maggie said, "Yes." "Why?" Maggie thought about it. Not a long pause. More the pause of someone who has a real answer and wants to give it accurately. "Because we belong there now. Not because someone told us we do, because we made ourselves belong there. There's a difference." Crandall wrote something. "Is there anything at Twin Pines that frightens you or makes you feel unsafe?" Maggie said, "No." Then, "There was a fence wire that got loose in the east pasture 2 weeks ago, and that was a little dangerous until Pete fixed it. But that's just ranching." The sound that came from the benches that time was more identifiable. Several people were not entirely successful at suppressing it. Crandall's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said. Lily was next. She was more nervous than Maggie. Her hands were in her lap, and she wasn't meeting Crandall's eyes right away, and Evelyn sat in her bench and breathed steadily on her behalf. Crandall asked her similar questions, and Lily answered them carefully. When he asked what she'd been doing at the ranch, she said, "I play piano. There's one in the front room." Then, as if she'd been deciding whether to say the next part, "I've been writing music. I've never had time to do that before." "You wrote your own music?" Crandall said. 3 pieces, Lily said. Then she looked up at him directly for the first time. I can play one, if it would help. Crandall looked at her, looked at the room, looked back. There's no piano in this courthouse, he said. Lily said, I know. I just thought I'd offer. There was a longer pause from the benches this time. Not laughter, more the sound of people exhaling something they'd been holding. Grace was last. Grace sat in the stand and looked at Crandall with the same expression she used when she was assessing an unfamiliar animal. Attentive, honest, not particularly intimidated. Crandall said, Grace Carter. Yes, Grace said. 7 years old. Yes. What do you do at the ranch? Grace said, I take care of the animals, mostly the horses. Ember was scared when we got there, and she's better now. Scout is my friend. I help Mrs. Vance feed the chickens, and I've been learning which plants in the kitchen garden the horses can eat, and which ones are bad for them. Crandall said, Who taught you about the plants? I figured it out, Grace said. Mr. Mercer told me which books to look at. Crandall wrote something. Then, Do you feel safe at Twin Pines? Grace looked at him. It was the look she'd given Scout through the first week of careful distance, the look of a creature deciding something important. Safer than I've ever felt anywhere, she said. Fitch did not question the girls. That decision, made apparently just before the session resumed after the girls' testimony, told Evelyn more than almost anything else about how Harold's side read the afternoon. Harold Pruitt took the stand in the late afternoon with the reasonable voice and the measured expression and presented his version of events, which was organized and careful, and in which he was a man who had taken in a desperate relative out of duty, had attempted to find a practical solution to a difficult debt situation, and was now legitimately concerned about the welfare of 3 minor children placed with an unmarried man under a contract arrangement that deserved proper scrutiny. He was good. Evelyn gave him that. He'd told this story to himself enough times that it had the quality of something he believed. Ware stood for cross-examination with the expression he wore when he'd been waiting for something. He asked Harold about the land speculation arrangement with Dorset. Harold's answer was careful. Ware asked about the timeline of the debts. Specifically, when Harold had accrued obligations that created financial pressure leading up to August. Harold's answers stayed careful, but needed more words. Ware asked whether Harold had explored any alternatives to a public auction for the Carter family, other relatives, charitable organizations, a direct loan arrangement. Harold said he'd considered options. Ware asked him to name one. Harold said the auction had seemed the most practical. Ware said, Most practical for whom? Harold said, For everyone involved. Ware said, Including 3 children between the ages of 7 and 9 who were presented to a crowd of men and offered as labor? It was legal. I didn't ask if it was legal, Ware said. I asked if it was practical for them. The room had gone very quiet. Harold said, The situation required no further questions, Ware said, and sat down. Closing statements were brief. The day was running long and the light through the windows had gone from pale to dim. Fitch made his argument cleanly. Welfare standards, proper inquiry, legitimate concerns. He was doing what he could with what he had, and what he had not been enough. Ware said 4 things. The contract transfer was legal on its face. The children were demonstrably thriving by every observable measure. The complaint had been filed not out of concern for the children, but out of the complainant's financial and reputational interests. And the court had heard today from people with no stake in the outcome. A doctor, a shopkeeper, a man with active grievances against Mercer, all of whom said the same thing. He sat down. Crandall said he would take it under advisement and have a decision within 2 days. He did not say anything else. He gathered his papers and left the bench, and the room exhaled. Harold Pruitt crossed the room, not to Evelyn, to Mercer. He stood in front of Mercer with the reasonable expression and said quietly, This doesn't end here. Mercer looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Then I guess we'll be here for it. Harold left. Evelyn stood beside Mercer in the courtroom as the benches cleared around them, the afternoon light going gray and cold in the windows. Her daughters gathered close, Grace leaning against Mercer's arm in a way that was entirely unconscious, Lily beside Evelyn with her hand in Evelyn's. Maggie standing slightly apart with her arms folded in her habitual way, watching the room empty. Pete appeared at her shoulder. "How do you think it went?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. It was the honest answer. Mercer said, "It went better than it could have." "That's not the same as good," she said. "No," he said, "but it's what we've got tonight." They went out into the November cold, all five of them, and Pete, and the town moved around them in its ordinary way. Horses at rails, a light in the saloon window, the hardware store closing up for the day. And Evelyn walked through it and thought about Crandall's face when Maggie said we made ourselves belong there, and thought about Lily offering to play piano in a courthouse that had no piano, and thought about Grace saying safer than I've ever felt anywhere in the voice she used when she was telling the truth about something important. Whatever the decision was, those things had been said in a room full of people. They were in the record now. They couldn't be taken back. It wasn't enough. But it was real, and real was what she'd been working toward since the first morning she woke up in the small plain room at Twin Pines and decided she was going to figure out what came next. She got in the wagon. The girls climbed in behind her. Mercer took the reins. The team moved out onto the road toward home, and the courthouse fell away behind them, and the Kansas dark came down around them like a weight, and also like a blanket, and none of them talked much on the drive back, which was all right. Some things didn't need words right away. The 2 days Judge Crandall had asked for stretched into 3, and then 4. And by the 5th morning, the waiting had become its own kind of weather at Twin Pines. Present in everything, not spoken about directly, altering the atmosphere of every room. Mercer went about his work the way he always did, which was to say, methodically and without visible disturbance. But Evelyn noticed that he checked the road from town more than usual, and that he'd repaired the same section of fence rail on the western side twice, which was the kind of thing a man does when his hands need something to do and his mind is elsewhere. Pete had developed a habit of appearing in doorways and then finding reasons to be somewhere else, which was Pete's version of hovering. Mrs. Vance baked more than usual, and the kitchen smelled of bread and sugar and the particular warmth of a woman doing something productive because the alternative was standing still. Evelyn spent the waiting time writing letters. Not to anyone in particular, not yet. More an organized accumulation of thoughts she'd been having since the courtroom. She'd been thinking, since the day she stood on the courthouse steps, about what came after. Not in a distant, dreaming way, but in the practical way she thought about everything. What was the problem? What were the materials? What was the sequence? The problem was that what had happened to her family was legal. Not just possible, not just cruel. Legal, structured, built into the way things worked. And if it had happened to them, with their particular combination of bad luck and a relative with Harold Pruitt's specific appetite, it was happening to other women, other children. She didn't write that down yet. She let it sit. What she did write were notes on every detail of the legal process she'd been through. The documents, the language, the specific provisions in the labor contract law that had made the auction possible. Ware had explained most of it during their preparation, and she'd listened with the same attention she gave everything, and now she was writing it out from memory, organizing it, finding the places where the language was vague enough to allow things that shouldn't be allowed. She was at the kitchen table on the 5th morning when the rider came from town. She heard hoofbeats before she saw anything, and something in the speed of them, not casual, deliberate, brought her to the window. A young man she didn't recognize, moving at a pace that meant something. She was at the front door before he reached the porch. "Mrs. Carter?" he said, pulling up. He was maybe 17, out of breath. "Yes? Judge Crandall's clerk. He asked me to bring word. The decision's ready. He's asking both parties to come to the courthouse this afternoon, 2 o'clock. She said, "Thank you." She went to find Mercer. He was in the barn, and when she told him he stood for a moment with a brush in one hand and didn't say anything, the way he absorbed information before responding to it. 2 o'clock, he said. "Yes." He set the brush down. "I'll tell Pete to watch the girls until we know." "I want the girls there," Evelyn said. Mercer looked at her. "They were in that courtroom," she said. "They spoke. Whatever the decision is, they should hear it in person, not from me later trying to find words for it." He thought about it. She could see him turning it over. The protective instinct against the other thing, the recognition that her daughters were not fragile in the way that needed protecting from reality. "All right," he said. They went inside to tell the girls, and Mrs. Vance, without being asked, immediately started pressing the girls' good clothes, which she'd already washed and had been hanging in the back room since the hearing. There was something in the act, the ironing board coming out, the careful attention to a collar, that Evelyn filed away as one of the things she'd remember about this woman who had never said an unnecessary word of warmth and had consistently done the warm thing anyway. They were in the wagon by noon, which gave them time enough that the drive to Red Creek didn't have to be rushed. The day was cold and clear, the kind of Kansas winter day where the sky was a hard pale blue and the bare cottonwoods stood very still because there was no wind. Evelyn sat on the bench beside Mercer. The girls were in the back. Grace had her coat collar turned up and her chin down, watching the road unscroll behind them. Lily sat straight and was quiet in the way that meant she was managing something. Maggie had brought the supply ledger, which under other circumstances Evelyn might have found absurd, but under these circumstances understood entirely. Maggie dealt with uncertainty by keeping her hands on something she could calculate. After a while, Mercer said, "Whatever he decides, let's not do that," Evelyn said, not harshly. "Let's wait and see what he decides first." He was quiet. Then, "Fair." They drove the rest of the way without talking much, which had become their natural mode. Not silence that needed filling, but silence that was doing its own work. Grace from the back pointed out a hawk on a fence post and said it was the same kind as the one she'd seen at the east pasture last week, which no one confirmed or denied, but which seemed to settle something for her. Eat. The courthouse was less crowded than the hearing day, but not empty. Word had moved through Red Creek the way word moved through small towns, quickly, selectively, and attached to everyone's existing opinions about the matter. About 20 people had found reasons to be present, including Margaret Ostrowski, who was sitting in the third bench with her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who'd decided her testimony was an investment and she intended to see the return on it. Doc Harrell was near the back. Whitfield, who had no reason to be there and was there anyway, which Evelyn took note of. Harold Pruitt was already at his table, Fitch beside him. Harold's expression was the patient one, as always, but Evelyn could see, she'd been reading him for months now, that the patience was thinner than it had been at the start of the hearing. 5 days of waiting had cost him something. Ware was at the other table, and he stood when they came in and shook Mercer's hand and nodded at Evelyn with an expression that communicated nothing specific, which she supposed was appropriate. She would have liked a hint and knew she wasn't going to get one. The girls sat in the front bench. Pete materialized from somewhere in the back of the room. He'd driven in separately, apparently, without telling anyone he planned to come, which was the Pete Halloran way of doing things that mattered to him. Judge Crandall entered at exactly 2 o'clock. Saturday. Arranged his papers with the deliberateness of a man who was not going to be hurried. "I've reviewed the testimony, the documentation submitted by both parties, and the relevant statutes," he said without preamble. He looked at the room over his spectacles, an even sweeping look that didn't stop on any particular face. "This has not been a simple matter to assess, and I want to be clear about what I've been assessing." He set down his papers and took his spectacles off. The room was very quiet. "The inquiry concerns 2 distinct questions," he said. "First, whether the transfer of the Carter family labor contract to Caleb Mercer was conducted lawfully. Second, whether the welfare of the minor children, Margaret, Lillian, and Grace Carter, is adequately served by their current placement at Twin Pines Ranch." He paused. Not for effect, Evelyn thought. More because he was a man who said things in order and moved to the next thing when the previous one was finished. On the first question, the lawfulness of the transfer, "I find no evidence that Caleb Mercer exerted improper influence or coercion upon Harold Pruitt in the course of the August auction. The auction was organized and conducted by Mr. Pruitt himself. Mr. Mercer made an offer within the established process. Mr. Pruitt accepted it. The evidence submitted by Mr. Ware, including testimony from individuals with no favorable disposition toward Mr. Mercer, does not support the claim of coercive conduct." He put his spectacles back on. "The complaint on this ground is dismissed." Harold's jaw moved. It was small, barely visible, but Evelyn saw it. "On the second question," Crandall said, "the welfare of the children." The room tightened. Evelyn felt Mercer beside her go very still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. I've heard testimony from a physician, a merchant, a neighboring rancher, the ranch foreman, and the children themselves, Crandall said. I have also heard from Mrs. Evelyn Carter, whose account of the circumstances that brought her family to Red Creek I found to be detailed, consistent, and credible. He paused. I have also reviewed the documentation she submitted, which is among the most thorough records I have seen presented in a civil inquiry of this nature. Across the room, Evelyn heard something, a small exhale, coming from Harold's direction. Not loud, just the sound of a man understanding which way this was going before it finished going there. The minor children, by every observable measure, are thriving, Crandall said. They are fed, housed, educated in practical skills, and engaged in work appropriate to their ages. More importantly, and I want to be precise here, they are not afraid. Children who are being exploited or mistreated develop certain recognizable behaviors. What I observed from these 3 girls was not that. He looked down at his papers. Grace Carter, age 7, described Twin Pines Ranch as the safest place she has ever felt. I have no basis on which to doubt her. Lily reached across the bench and found Evelyn's hand without looking. The current placement is ruled appropriate, Crandall said. The minor children will remain at Twin Pines Ranch under the contract arrangement with Caleb Mercer. The inquiry is closed. He set down his papers. He looked at the room one more time, and then he did something Evelyn had not anticipated. He looked directly at Harold Pruitt, and he said one more thing. Mr. Pruitt, the legal mechanisms that made this arrangement possible are not ones I have authority to strike from the books. That is not my role here. But I will say, clearly and for the record, that the use of those mechanisms, as this case has demonstrated, creates conditions in which vulnerable families can be treated as assets rather than people. That is not a finding I can act on in this courtroom. It is, however, a finding that should not leave this room quietly. He held Harold's look for a moment. Court is adjourned. The room moved, the way rooms do after a held breath is released. Noise, movement, the scrape of benches, voices. Evelyn sat still for a moment while it happened around her. Lily's hand was still in hers. On the other side of her, Mercer had his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, not weeping, just taking a moment inside himself that he apparently needed, and she let him have it. Maggie appeared at her elbow. Her face was composed in the way it always was when she was absorbing something significant. "We stay," Maggie said. It was not a question. "We stay," Evelyn said. Maggie nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled, and went back to sit beside Grace, who had climbed over the bench in defiance of all propriety and was now standing in the middle of the floor with an expression of such transparent relief that several people near her were looking at her the way you look at something that clears the air. Pete came from the back of the room and stopped at Evelyn's shoulder. He said nothing. He just stood there, which was the Pete Halloran version of everything. Edmund Ware was gathering his papers, and he looked at Evelyn over his spectacles and said, "You documented things I couldn't have asked for better." "I've been accounting for things my whole life," she said. "I know," he said. "You told me." Mercer raised his head and looked at the room and then at Evelyn and said, "All right?" "All right," she said. Across the room, Harold Pruitt and Aldous Fitch were leaving. Harold had his hat on and his coat buttoned, and his expression was the patient one. She'd wondered if this moment, when it came, would crack it. It didn't. That was Harold. He would reorganize what had happened into a narrative that preserved his own sense of himself, and he would file it away, and he would go on. She'd known enough people like him to understand that defeat didn't change them, it just redirected them. She let him go. He was no longer the problem in the room. Margaret Ostrowski stopped her on the way out of the courthouse, on the steps, in the cold, clear afternoon. "I'm glad it went right," she said. "Thank you for what you said," Evelyn said. "About children getting small." Margaret Ostrowski looked at her with the 30-year observation in her eyes. "I've seen it enough times," she said. "Yours weren't. That was what I could say, so I said it." "It mattered," Evelyn said. Margaret Ostrowski nodded once and went down the steps, and that was the entirety of it. No warmth performed, just one honest person telling another that she'd seen something true and said so. Evelyn watched her go and thought, That's what courage actually looks like in practice. Not grand, just accurate at the right moment. Out. On the drive back, something had shifted in the wagon. Not dramatically. There was no transformation scene, no moment where everything reorganized itself into something easy. It was more like a pressure that had been present for months had equalized, and the air was different for its absence. Grace fell asleep against Lily's shoulder before they were out of town, which was both completely Grace and also the most eloquent possible statement about the release of the past weeks. Lily sat with her sister's weight against her and looked out at the Kansas countryside going past in the late afternoon light and started, very quietly, to hum something. It took Evelyn a few bars to recognize it as the composition Lily had offered to play for Judge Crandall. Maggie had put the ledger away. Mercer drove and didn't say much, which was his way, but somewhere on the road between Red Creek and Twin Pines he said, "Crandall was right about the law." "Yes," Evelyn said. "What happens to the next family that ends up on those courthouse steps?" She looked at him. He was watching the road. "I've been thinking about that," she said. He glanced at her. "Since when?" "Since before the hearing," she said. "Since August, really. Since I was standing on those steps and I understood that what was happening was legal, which meant the problem wasn't Harold specifically. Harold was an instrument. The problem is what he had access to." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "What would you do about it?" "I'd start with the documentation," she said. "The same way I started with the inquiry. What's the law exactly? Where's the language that allows this? Who has the standing to change it? Legislators, state officials?" She paused. "Then I'd find the people who have reasons to care and the ability to do something, not just sympathy, actual standing." "That's a long fight," he said. "Yes," she said. Another pause. Then, "You'd need support. People who will take you seriously, not just—" He stopped. Started again. "A woman doing that alone in 1887 is going to run into a lot of closed doors." "I know that," she said. "I'm not saying don't do it," he said. He was quiet a moment. "I'm saying you shouldn't have to do it alone." She looked at him. The road ahead was straight and flat and going gold in the afternoon light. He kept his eyes on it. "Are you offering?" she said. "I'm saying the ranch has some standing in this county," he said. "And I know some people in Topeka who owe me a reasonable conversation. And I've got a lawyer now who apparently enjoys difficult cases." He paused. "If you're going to do this, that's what I can put toward it." She thought about what she would have said to this offer 3 months ago, standing in the square, or in the East Room that first night, or in the kitchen when he'd left coffee next to her without comment. She thought about how much the answer would have cost her then, how much of herself she'd have had to hold back to accept help without it feeling like surrender. That was then. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Lily from the back had started singing words to the melody now, softly, half to herself, the lyrics not quite finished yet, more the shape of them than the thing itself. Grace was still asleep. The wagon moved on down the road. Diyut. The weeks after the decision had a different texture than the weeks before it. The anxiety that had been running underneath everything, that low-frequency hum of uncertainty that Evelyn had learned to function around the way you function around a noise you can't turn off, was gone. What replaced it wasn't exactly peace. It was something more active than that, more like the feeling of ground under your feet after a long stretch of uncertain footing. The contract still had 3 years and some months left to run. The practical reality of their lives hadn't changed. The work was the same, the mornings were the same, the small plain rooms were the same. But the quality of inhabiting those things had shifted in some way Evelyn couldn't have described precisely to someone who hadn't felt it. Grace noticed it first, which was typical. A week after the decision, she came to Evelyn in the kitchen and said, "Ember lets me brush her now." Evelyn looked up from the ledger. "Since when?" "Yesterday?" Grace said. She stood still the whole time. She said it the way she said things she was proud of. Not boasting, more like reporting something she found genuinely remarkable. "That's weeks of work," Evelyn said. "I know," Grace said. She needed to decide. She considered this. Some things you can't rush. Evelyn looked at her 7-year-old daughter, who had learned this from a horse. "No," she said, "you can't. The horse work had been expanding quietly for months, but after the decision, something in Grace stopped holding back. She was out in the barn every morning before breakfast, and Mercer had started including her when he made decisions about the horses. Not performing inclusion, just actually asking her opinion, because her opinion had turned out to be consistently useful. The day he showed her how to check a horse's hooves properly, and she demonstrated back to him with a precision that made him nod and say, "That's right, that's exactly right." Evelyn watched it from across the barn and thought about the word trajectory. This was one beginning. Lily's music had started to move into the house in a different way. She'd been playing mostly alone before, door closed, careful about the space it took up. After the decision, she started leaving the door open, and the music moved through the house the way air does, and nobody remarked on it, but everyone organized themselves around it slightly. Mrs. Vance's tempo in the kitchen matching something Lily was playing, Pete coming in from the yard and standing in the hallway for a moment before going up, Mercer with his coffee in the doorway on Sunday afternoons. One evening, Cooper, the young ranch hand who'd made the comment at the first supper and had been carefully appropriate ever since, stopped in the hall and said, "What is that? The one you're playing now?" Lily, not stopping. "Mine." "You wrote it?" "Yes." A pause. "It's good," Cooper said. He had the awkward sincerity of a young man saying something honest that he wasn't used to saying. "I don't know much about music, but it's good." "Thank you," Lily said, and meant it, and kept playing. Maggie, meanwhile, had begun working on something she hadn't fully announced. A reorganization of the ranch's record-keeping that went beyond the ledger corrections. She'd identified that the way supply orders were being tracked didn't connect well to the herd data, which meant it was difficult to see the relationship between feed costs and cattle weight over time. She'd drafted a system, on her own, in the evenings, at the kitchen table, and shown it to Pete one Thursday night with the expression of someone delivering a report rather than requesting permission. Pete had looked at it for a long time, then he'd said, "Mercer should see this." "I know," Maggie said. I was going to ask." She showed it to Mercer at breakfast the next morning, spreading the papers out beside his coffee cup with the focused directness she brought to things she'd decided. He looked at it for several minutes without speaking, which Maggie understood by now as attention rather than judgment. Then he said, "Where'd you learn to build a system like this?" "I just thought about what information we needed and what would make it visible," Maggie said. "I looked at how the ledger connected to the other records and found the gaps." "Did your mother help?" "I showed it to her last night," Maggie said. "She found two things I'd missed." Mercer looked at the papers again. "It's good work," he said. "Better than what we've got." "I know," Maggie said. Mercer looked at her over the papers with an expression that was partly amusement and partly something else. Recognition, maybe, of a specific quality of person. "You're not modest," he said. "No," Maggie agreed, "but I'm accurate." He had the system implemented within the month. Harold Pruitt, as Evelyn had predicted, did not disappear. He reorganized. In December, a letter arrived from a state office in Topeka. Not an inquiry this time, but a formal correspondence regarding the labor contract statutes, requesting information about the Carter case as part of what the letter described as a routine review of contract welfare standards. The language was bureaucratic and careful, and Evelyn read it twice and recognized Harold's fingerprints without finding them explicitly. He'd found another approach. An administrative one, quieter, the kind that could create difficulties through process rather than direct confrontation. She brought it to Ware, who read it and said, "He's moved up a level." "I know," she said. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we respond formally and completely," Ware said. "Document everything, same as before." He's hoping the administrative process generates enough friction that it becomes easier to settle, which in his mind means returning to some version of the original arrangement. "It's not going to," she said. "No," Ware agreed, "but we have to engage with the process anyway, because not engaging looks like avoidance." She wrote the response herself, over 3 evenings, with Ware reviewing and adjusting the legal language where needed. It was 20 pages, detailed, organized, supported by documentation, and written in the kind of clear, direct language that left no available ambiguity for someone looking for purchase. When it was done, Ware said, "You've written more useful legal documentation in 4 months than most people produce in a decade of litigation." "It's not that different from running a household," she said. It actually is, he said. But your instincts for what matters and how to present it, those are not common. She filed the response and kept working on the other thing. The notes she'd been making, the accumulation of thoughts about the law and how to change it. She'd found, through Ware, the name of a state legislator in Topeka named Alderman Crane, who had spoken publicly once about child welfare standards. Crane had said something tepid and general that hadn't amounted to anything, but he'd said it, which meant the door was theoretically not locked. She was writing to him when Mercer found her at the kitchen table one evening in January, with papers spread to the edges and a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten. He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it back. "Who are you writing to?" "A legislator in Topeka," she said. "Name of Crane." "About the law." "About the law." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the papers on the table, not reading them, just taking in the scope of them. "This is going to take a long time," he said. "Yes," she said. "And it's going to be harder than the inquiry," he said. "The inquiry was one judge in one county. This is the state apparatus." "I know," she said. "And Harold's already moving in that direction, which means you're going to run into him again." "I expect so." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wrote to the Topeka people I mentioned, the ones who owe me a conversation. I've got two who are willing to meet. One's a county commissioner, one sits on an agricultural committee that has some crossover with welfare legislation." She looked up from the paper. "When?" she said. "March," he said. "I thought you'd want to come." She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the January lamplight, with the ranch quiet around them and her daughters asleep upstairs, and the papers spread between them like a map of something that didn't exist yet but was being built. "Yes," she said. "I want to come." He nodded, got up, made fresh coffee, not just for himself, both cups, and set one next to her papers. Then he went back to reading something of his own at the far end of the table, and she went back to her letter, and the lamp held steady between them in the winter dark. February brought the first real snow of the season, which came overnight and covered the ranch in the specific quiet that snow makes, a muffled, softened version of all the ordinary sounds. Evelyn woke to it and lay still for a moment, listening to the changed texture of the world, and then heard Grace's voice from the next room saying, with complete delight, "It snowed!" She could hear the scramble of Grace finding her boots. "Coat," Evelyn called, "before you go anywhere." "I know," Grace called back. She did not know, actually. She'd gotten halfway to the stairs bootless before she came back. But she put the coat on, and by the time the rest of the household was up, she had been outside long enough to have made detailed observations about the depth of the snow at various points around the yard, to have checked on Ember and the other horses, and to have determined that Scout found snow deeply objectionable, but would tolerate it in small quantities if properly motivated. Mercer watched her report these findings at breakfast, with the expression that had been showing up more on his face in the past months. Not quite a smile, more the way a face looks when something it didn't expect to feel like warmth does. After breakfast, Maggie said, "Can we make something? In the snow?" Nobody had a specific objection. What followed was an hour in the yard. Not organized exactly, more like 4 people and a dog approaching the same material in 4 completely different ways. Grace made careful small structures near the barn. Lily lay down in the snow and looked at the sky, which she explained was something she'd always wanted to do and never had the space for on the old farm. Maggie attempted a scale model of the ranch layout, which collapsed twice and improved on the 3rd try. Pete watched from the barn door with an expression he probably thought was neutral. Mercer came outside in his heavy coat and stood watching for a while. Then Grace said, "Come help," without looking up from her structure, and he went and crouched down next to her in the snow. And she explained what she was building, a shelter for a hypothetical small animal, built to specifications she'd apparently been considering, and he listened and made suggestions that she accepted or didn't based on her own assessment. Evelyn watched from the porch with her coffee. She was thinking about Thomas, not with the sharp grief of the early months, more the way you think about someone who is real and is now absent, the specific texture of them. Thomas would have thrown himself into the snow without hesitation and built something large and impractical and enjoyed every second of it. She could see him in Grace's delight, the physical expressiveness, the complete absorption in the immediate thing. He'd been like that. She'd loved him for it. She thought, "I am glad he existed." She thought, I am glad the girls have his quality in them, the one that finds the thing in front of it and gives it everything. She thought, I am still here. That was not a small thought, actually. Some mornings it was the largest one she had. The snow kept falling, softly, and below her in the yard her daughters were making things that wouldn't last. And a dog was expressing grievances about winter with the dignity of an animal who felt his grievances deserved an audience. And Caleb Mercer was crouched in the snow next to a 7-year-old discussing the structural requirements of a hypothetical shelter with the same seriousness he brought to fence repairs. And Pete had abandoned the pretense of neutrality and was offering suggestions from the barn door. It was not the life she had planned. It was the life that was here. And it was real. And it was hers. And she was not willing to waste it. She went inside and picked up her pen. She had a letter to finish. The letter to Alderman Crane took 4 drafts before Evelyn was satisfied with it, which was 1 more than she'd needed for the inquiry response and 3 fewer than she'd feared. The final version was 6 pages, not long, not short, calibrated to say exactly what needed saying without giving a man she'd never met a reason to set it aside. She laid out the Carter case in plain language, not as a personal appeal but as an illustration of a structural problem in the law. She named the specific provisions that had permitted the auction. She asked directly whether the legislator believed those provisions served the stated purpose of the law, which was the welfare of families and children. She sent it in February. Crane's response came in late March, a single page formally worded that said he had found the letter thoughtful and was willing to arrange a meeting in Topeka at his earliest convenience. He suggested April. She read it twice and then went to find Mercer, who was in the barn, and handed it to him without comment. He read it, handed it back. April, he said. April, she said. He nodded the way he nodded when something was going to happen, and he was already making room for it. I'll write to the commissioner and the agriculture man. See if we can't get more than 1 meeting out of the trip. I'll prepare documentation, she said. I know you will, he said, and there was something in it, not condescension, the opposite, a straightforward acknowledgement of something that was simply true. She went back inside and started on the documentation. Potomki. The Topeka trip happened in the 3rd week of April, which was late enough that the Kansas spring had made a genuine effort. The land coming back green after the winter, the creek running high, the cottonwoods beginning their annual optimism. Evelyn and Mercer drove to the rail station in Red Creek and took the train, which was the first time she'd been on a train since she'd come to Kansas 12 years earlier as a young wife with Thomas and a trunk of their combined belongings. The girls stayed at Twin Pines with Mrs. Vance and Pete, an arrangement that had required approximately no convincing because Maggie had the household accounts she wanted to reorganize, and Grace had a new foal to monitor, and Lily had the piano and the conclusion of a piece she'd been working on since February. They were, Evelyn had come to understand, not children who needed to be entertained or distracted or managed through absence. They had work, which they'd chosen, which was different from work assigned. And that difference was the whole point. On the train, Mercer spread his own notes on the seat between them. He'd done more preparation than she'd known. Correspondence with the county commissioner and the agriculture committee member, information about the political landscape around welfare legislation in the state, the names of 2 other legislators who'd shown any interest in the topic. When did you do all this? She said. Over the winter, he said. You didn't tell me. I was going to tell you when I had something useful to tell, he said. Otherwise it's just talk about doing a thing instead of doing it. She looked at him for a moment, then at the notes. This is good work. I know some people, he said. It was not modest. It was just accurate, the same way Maggie was accurate. She was learning that this was a family trait, which was a thought that arrived quietly and sat there. The meetings in Topeka ran over 2 days. Alderman Crane was a careful man in his 50s, politically experienced enough to listen well without committing to anything in the first conversation, which Evelyn had expected and planned for. She laid out the documentation, the specific statutory language, the Carter case as example, 3 additional cases she'd researched through Ware's connections involving similar situations across 2 neighboring counties. She was not angry in the meeting, which took effort, because the right tool for this room was precision, not anger. Anger was for the people who already agreed with you. Crane asked questions. They were good questions, which meant he'd read the letter more than once. He asked about enforcement mechanisms, about the economic interests that would oppose reform, about what specific statutory changes would address the problem without creating other complications. She answered everything. Mercer answered the questions that were about ranch economics and labor realities, which he knew from 20 years of experience and could articulate in the plain language of someone who'd lived it. By the end of the first meeting, Crane had not committed, but he'd asked them to return the following morning, which was more than a polite dismissal. The second day was harder. The Agriculture Committee member, a man named Bowles who had ranching interests and was not unfriendly but was not persuaded, spent 40 minutes explaining why the existing laws served important economic functions and why changes would create instability. Evelyn listened to all of it and did not interrupt, and then spent 20 minutes disassembling it piece by piece with documentation and the specific, irrefutable example of 3 girls between 7 and 9 years old being sold in a public square. Bowles said, "That's one case." "I gave you 4, she said. "I found 4 in 6 weeks of looking. I was not looking professionally or with any resources. I was looking from a ranch kitchen with a lamp and a pen and whatever ware could get me." She paused. "If you would like to have the state conduct a formal review of how many cases there have been in the past decade, I would encourage it. I believe the number would be clarifying." Bowles looked at her across the table with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't calibrated for. He looked at Mercer. Mercer looked back without expression. "You're asking for a bill," Bowles said. "I'm asking for a conversation that leads to a bill," she said. "I understand how this works. I'm not asking you to do something today. I'm asking you to believe that it needs to be done, and to be one of the people who does it." The meeting ended without a commitment from Bowles, but Crane, in the hallway after, said quietly that he thought there was a path, and that he'd be in correspondence with Ware. On the train home, Evelyn sat with the fatigue of 2 days of precise, careful, controlled arguing and let it settle into her body. Mercer said, "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said, "but it's the right kind." "What's the right kind?" "The kind where you spent the energy on something real," she said. "Not the kind where you spent it holding yourself together." He looked out the window at the Kansas landscape moving past. "Bowles isn't going to make it easy." "No," she said, "but Crane is going to move. I could feel it. He's made up his mind about the right answer and he's working out the political cost." "You could feel it," he repeated. "I've been reading people my whole life," she said. "I had to. I didn't have other options." She paused. "Thomas was the optimist. I was the one who figured out which optimism was worth following." It was the most she'd said about Thomas in a while. Mercer didn't respond immediately, which was his way. He let things settle before he decided what they needed. Then he said, "He'd have liked seeing you in that room." She thought about that, about Thomas in a Topeka legislative office, which was both impossible to picture and entirely possible to picture. He'd have been too much, too warm, too broad, but the warmth would have landed on someone. "He would have talked too much," she said. "Probably," Mercer said. "And it would have worked anyway," she said. "Somehow, it always did." She looked out the window. Spring Kansas going past, green and enormous and indifferent to anything human. "I'm glad you were there instead," she said. "In that room." "So am I," he said. Tick. Harold Pruitt made his last move in June. It came through the administrative channel he'd opened in December. A formal state welfare review of the Twin Pines arrangement, triggered by the ongoing correspondence he'd apparently been maintaining with a sympathetic functionary in the welfare office. The review required a site visit. A state official would come to the ranch, inspect the conditions, interview the children, and file a report. Evelyn read the notification and felt, not fear exactly, but a familiar bracing. The same way you brace before cold water, knowing it's coming, knowing you can manage it. "It's Harold," she said to Mercer, handing him the paper. "I know," he said. "What do we do?" "We let them come," she said. "We show them exactly what's here, which is what we've been doing for 9 months." The state official arrived on a Thursday in late June, a woman, which Evelyn had not expected. Her name was Mrs. Doris Pell, and she was somewhere in her late 40s, compact, with the manner of someone who had seen a wide range of human circumstances and had developed strong opinions about all of them. She arrived with a notebook and the expression of a person who did not make her conclusions in advance of her evidence. Evelyn met her at the door. She shook her hand and said, "Come in, I'll show you everything." She meant it, which Mrs. Pell appeared to register. The visit lasted 4 hours. Mrs. Pell walked through the house, saw the rooms, asked about sleeping arrangements and meals and schooling. Evelyn had, in the fall, arranged a Tuesday and Thursday schedule with the school teacher in Red Creek for all 3 girls, which was documented. She spoke to Mrs. Vance, who answered her questions in the plain declarative way Mrs. Vance answered all questions, and whose lack of performance clearly registered as something like credibility. She spoke to Pete about the work the girls did and the nature of it. Pete said, "The oldest girl overhauled my record-keeping system in January. We've saved about 8% on supply costs since then." He said it without elaboration, as a fact among facts. Mrs. Pell went to the barn with Evelyn and found Grace there, which was where Grace usually was at this hour. Grace was working with Ember, and the mare who'd been skittish and difficult when they arrived was standing calmly while Grace checked her hooves with the method Mercer had showed her, systematic, patient, talking to the horse in the low, steady voice throughout. Mrs. Pell stood at the barn entrance and watched for a moment. Then she said quietly to Evelyn, "How old is she?" "She'll be 8 in September," Evelyn said. Mrs. Pell wrote something in her notebook. She spoke to Lily in the front room where Lily was practicing. Lily answered her questions directly and then said, "Would you like to hear something?" Mrs. Pell said yes, apparently because when Evelyn passed the door 20 minutes later, the conversation had stopped and Lily was playing, and Mrs. Pell was sitting in the chair by the window listening with her notebook closed in her lap. She spoke to Maggie last, which Evelyn suspected was deliberate. She'd been building toward the oldest, the one with the most years and the clearest memory of before. Maggie sat across the kitchen table from Mrs. Pell and answered every question with the precision and directness she brought to everything. And when Mrs. Pell asked, "Do you remember what things were like before you came to Twin Pines?" Maggie said, "Yes." Then after a pause, "We were afraid most of the time. We're not afraid now. That's the main difference." Mrs. Pell wrote a great deal in her notebook after that. Before she left, she spoke to Evelyn alone on the porch. She said, "I want you to know that I read the documentation from the November inquiry before I came. I came because I was required to conduct the review. I did not come because I expected to find a problem." "I understand," Evelyn said, "but I'm glad you came anyway." Mrs. Pell looked at her. "Why?" Because the more people who see this, the clearer the record," Evelyn said. "I want a clear record. I want it recorded by as many people as possible that these children are thriving, because the law that allowed someone to threaten that is still on the books. And eventually that law is going to need witnesses." Mrs. Pell was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the yard, at the ranch, at the 2 pines at the entrance still standing the way they'd always stood. "Your correspondence with Alderman Crane," she said. "I'm aware of it." Evelyn said nothing. "The welfare office has an interest in those proceedings," Mrs. Pell said carefully. "Officially, we are a neutral body. Unofficially," she stopped. "I'll say only that not everyone in the state office is aligned with the position taken in the December correspondence." She picked up her bag and went to her horse. She looked back once, from the road, and nodded. Then she went. Evelyn stood on the porch for a while after. Harold's last move had turned in her hands. She wasn't sure he understood yet how thoroughly. Crane introduced a bill in September. It was not everything Evelyn had wanted, legislation rarely was, but it was more than she'd expected from a first attempt. It proposed formal welfare standards for labor contract arrangements involving minor children, required independent review of any contract transfer, and, the provision she'd fought hardest for in the correspondence, prohibited the use of labor contracts as a mechanism for debt settlement, where the contracted parties included children under the age of 14. The bill did not pass immediately. The Kansas State Legislature in 1887 moved with the particular speed of institutions that contain people with competing financial interests and limited urgency. Bowles opposed it. 2 other representatives with ranching interests expressed concern about the economic implications. There were revisions, amendments, counterproposals that Evelyn tracked through Ware's connections and her own growing correspondence network with other women who'd found their way into similar fights in other counties. She built that network the same way she'd built everything else. One letter at a time, one name leading to another, finding the people who had reasons to care and the capability to act. A woman in Douglas County who'd been through something similar. A teacher in Shawnee County who'd been documenting labor contract cases for 3 years. A physician in Leavenworth who treated children removed from contract situations and had data that was more powerful than any testimony. She wove them together. Ware helped with the legal language. Mercer made the introductions his standing in the county and state allowed him to make, quietly, without making himself the center of it, understanding she'd come to see that this was her fight and his job was to hold the door open and stand back. The bill passed in March of 1889, which was a year and 7 months after Crane introduced it, and 2 years and 7 months after Evelyn Carter stood on the courthouse steps in Red Creek with her daughters around her and understood that the law permitted what was happening to them. The final version was stronger in some places than the original, weaker in others. It wasn't perfect. Evelyn had stopped expecting perfect somewhere around the 4th revision. It was real, which was the thing she'd been working toward all along. The 4 years of the contract ended in the autumn of 1891, on a day that turned out to be unremarkable in the particular way that days that have been long anticipated often are. No ceremony, no formal moment. Ware had filed the completion documentation in August, and when September came, the contract was simply done, and they were simply free, legally, on paper, in all the ways that paper could express. The actual question had resolved itself earlier than that, and more quietly. It was the previous winter, January of 1891, one of the coldest they'd had at Twin Pines. That, Mercer said, the thing he'd been working toward for a long time. They were in the kitchen, late, the girls in bed, the wind doing something serious outside, and he'd been sitting across from her at the table where they'd spent so many evenings doing different kinds of work, and he'd said, with the directness he used for everything that actually mattered to him, "I'd like you to stay. Not because of the contract, when the contract's done." He looked at her. "I'd like all of you to stay." She'd been waiting for it, in the sense that she'd known for months that this was where things had been moving, in the quiet, undeclared way that things move when the people involved are too busy actually living to stop and announce them. She'd also been afraid of it, in a way she hadn't expected and took seriously. Not afraid of Mercer, afraid of the specific thing it meant to choose something again. To say yes to a life deliberately, after the previous life had ended in a way that had nothing to do with choice. She sat with it for long enough that he said, "You don't have to answer now." "I know," she said. "I'm answering. I'm just doing it slowly." He waited. "Thomas was a man I loved," she said. "I want to say that first because it matters. It doesn't go away, and I'm not pretending it does." "I know," he said. "I've got my own version of that." "Rebecca," she said. "Yes." They sat with both of those truths for a moment, the way you sit with things that are real and don't shrink when you look directly at them. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Not because it's practical, not because the ranch is good for the girls, though it is, but because I want to. Because this is where I've been doing the work that feels like mine, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because you're the only person I've met in a very long time who hears what I say instead of what they expected me to say." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not a small thing to offer." "No," she said. "It's not." They didn't solve anything else that night. They sat at the kitchen table a while longer and then went to bed. But the thing had been said, and said truly, and that was what mattered. Not the speech of it, not the performance of it, but the real thing underneath, offered between two imperfect people who had been through enough to know the difference. They married in April, before a judge in Red Creek, with the girls and Pete and Mrs. Vance and Edmund Ware and Margaret Ostrowski present. Whitfield came and stood in the back and didn't say anything particularly, and left before the celebrating started, which was so entirely in character that Evelyn found it genuinely moving. Grace cried, which surprised everyone, including Grace. Maggie did not cry, and stood straight and looked at Mercer with the assessing expression she'd had since the first day in the wagon. And then she said, "You'll do," which made Mercer laugh. A real one, full and unguarded. The kind she'd come to know was the most honest version of him. Lily played at the reception. Something she'd written for the occasion, long and varied, moving through different registers. Not a wedding march, more a conversation between different things that had found a way to exist together. Evelyn listened to it from across the room and thought, "That's what's happened to us. That's what it sounds like." A chat. Time, after that, did not stop being time. Hard years came and went, a drought in '93 that took a significant portion of the cattle and required decisions that kept Evelyn and Mercer up for weeks. A legal challenge to the welfare bill that they fought through Ware and Crane and ultimately won, though it took 18 months and more correspondence than she could count. The death of Scout in the winter of 1892, who went quietly in the barn with Grace beside him, Grace at 9, dry-eyed, in the way she was dry-eyed about real things, sitting with her hand on his side until it was over. That grief was quiet and complete, and Evelyn let Grace have it in full, the same way she'd had her own grief about Thomas, without rushing it, without substituting comfort for the real thing. The network of women she'd built continued to grow. 3 more welfare cases in the state were challenged with the documentation methods she'd developed, and 2 of them succeeded. A woman in Wyandotte County wrote to say she'd used Evelyn's framework to mount a case that had been pending for 2 years and had finally resolved in her favor. Evelyn wrote back and said what Ware had helped her see, which was, document everything. Name the specific provisions that created the problem, find the witnesses who have no stake in lying. She wrote it to woman after woman, and each letter was the same letter Thomas had never needed to write because he had the frontier's gift of optimism, and she'd always been the other kind, the kind that made the map. Maggie, at 16, was corresponding with an agricultural economist at the University of Kansas about her supply and herd management system, which had evolved far past its original form. At 18, she went to Lawrence for school, the first woman in the county, as far as anyone could verify, to go specifically for agricultural economics. She came back on holidays and spent half of them at the ledger table and the other half riding the north pasture with Pete, who was getting older and didn't say so but moved more slowly, and who seemed to require her company on those rides in a way neither of them acknowledged. Lily's music found its audience in increments. First Red Creek, then Dodge City, then Kansas City, where she performed for a real concert audience at 20 and stood in the wings beforehand with her hands shaking and went out anyway. She wrote to Evelyn after, "The shaking doesn't go away, you just go out with it." Evelyn wrote back, "That's the whole thing. That's all it ever is." Grace became what she had always been going to be. A woman who understood animals with the kind of bone-deep fluency that can't be taught, only grown. She studied with every veterinarian she could find, which in Kansas in the 1890s was limited, but not nothing. And then she went further, to St. Louis, to Chicago, to any place that was doing the work seriously. She came back to the ranch between stints, always. She was one of the first women in the state to hold a formal veterinary certificate, which she put on the wall of the barn at Twin Pines because that was where it made sense. The ranch grew, not dramatically. This was not a story about wealth, about the frontier dream paying out in gold. It grew the way real things grow, through accumulated small decisions, through work that was thought about rather than just done, through the specific advantage of having people around you who brought their full capacity to problems instead of the part of themselves they had energy left for after being afraid. In 1901, 13 years after the day Evelyn Carter stood on courthouse steps in Red Creek, the Kansas legislature passed an expanded version of the 1889 bill. Stronger language, broader protections, a formal state welfare office with actual authority and a budget. Crane had retired by then, but he'd trained successors, and the correspondence network Evelyn had built had grown into something with real political weight. The vote wasn't close. She was 45 years old. She sat in the visitors' gallery in Topeka and watched the vote and felt, not triumph exactly. Triumph implies surprise. She'd been working toward this specific outcome for 12 years and had believed it was possible for most of that time, which meant the arrival of it felt more like completion than victory. Mercer was beside her. He'd come to every meeting in Topeka, every significant moment in the legislative process, doing the thing he'd offered to do from the beginning, holding the door, standing back, adding what he could add without making it something it wasn't. He was 58 now, and his hair had gone fully gray, and the lines on his face had deepened past the point of counting. And he was, in her considered opinion, exactly the person she'd needed beside her. Not because he solved things for her, but because he stayed in the room. When the vote was recorded, he reached across and put his hand over hers on the railing, and she let it stay there. "Done," he said. "This part," she said. He almost smiled. "There's always another part with you." "Yes," she said. "That's true." There was another part. There was always another part. The law was passed and still needed to be enforced, which was different, and enforcement required watching, and watching required people willing to document and challenge and show up in rooms where they weren't automatically welcome. That work didn't end because a bill passed. Anyone who thought it did hadn't been paying attention. But the specific fight that had started on those courthouse steps in Red Creek in August of 1887, the one where 3 little girls had stood in a crowd of men and been priced like livestock, that fight had found its resolution. The law that permitted it was gone. The mechanism Harold Pruitt had reached for, and the men before him and the men before them had reached for, because it was there and it was legal and nobody had yet made it not be those things, that mechanism was gone. It would not be gone for everyone. There were other states, other mechanisms, other forms of the same appetite. Evelyn was not under the illusion that the world had been fixed. She'd never been the kind of person who needed that illusion. She was the kind of person who figured out what was in front of her and did the work that was possible. That was what she had. That was what she'd always had. It was enough. The last time she told this story, really told it, from the beginning, to someone who needed to hear it, she was 57 years old, sitting in the front room at Twin Pines Ranch, and the woman across from her was 26 with 2 small children, and had arrived at the ranch 3 days earlier, having left a situation in Douglas County that had taken everything except her children. The network had sent her. By 1913, there was a real network, documented, organized, with funding from 3 sources and the names of 50 women who could be called on. The young woman's name was Clara. She had the look Evelyn recognized. Not fear exactly, but the way people look when they've been operating at the edge of their capacity for so long that they've forgotten there's another way to be. The guarded eyes, the careful sitting, the reflex to check exits. Evelyn had her daughters in for supper. Maggie was visiting from Lawrence, where she'd become the thing she was always going to become. Grace had driven in from the South Ranch, where she kept her veterinary practice. Lily was in Kansas City, but she wrote letters, and Evelyn read pieces of them aloud sometimes when there was something worth sharing. She told Clara the essential facts of the arrangement, what the ranch could offer, what the network could provide, what Clara's rights were, before supper. After supper, the children asleep, the room quiet, Clara said, "How did you know it would be all right?" Evelyn thought about the question, about what she could honestly say. "I didn't," she said. "Not for a long time. I knew I was going to keep going regardless, which isn't the same thing." She paused. "The day we came here, I was looking for reasons not to trust it. I found them. There were 100 reasons not to trust it. But I also found a man who looked at us like we were people, and that was true whether I trusted it or not." "What if I can't?" Clara started. "You can," Evelyn said, not as reassurance, as a fact she'd earned the right to state. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it goes smoothly. I'm saying you're already doing the hardest part, which is choosing to be here rather than where you were." Clara looked at her hands. "The thing I had to learn," Evelyn said, "was that needing help doesn't mean you've lost. I spent a long time thinking strength meant not needing anything. What I found out is that the actual strength is the thing that survives needing help. The part that keeps working, keeps making decisions, keeps showing up." She paused. "That part is already there in you. I can see it. It's in the way you got here." Clara didn't say anything. But something in her sitting changed, a small shift, the way an animal relaxes when it's decided the immediate danger has passed. That shift. Evelyn had seen it in herself once, sitting on a hard bed in a small plain room at Twin Pines Ranch, listening to a ranch make its nighttime sounds around her. She recognized it now in other people the way you recognize something you felt in your own body. Later, she went to find Mercer. He was on the porch, the same chair, the night dark around him. Not with cold coffee now, just sitting in the specific way of a man who'd spent enough years doing things that he'd earned the sitting. She stood in the doorway. He heard her and looked. "She all right?" he said. "She will be," Evelyn said. "That's different from all right now, but she will be." He nodded. Made room, and she sat in the other chair, the one that had been hers by default for a long time now, worn to the shape of her presence. The Kansas night was very large and very old and completely indifferent to human concerns, which was the thing Evelyn had always loved about it. You couldn't ask it for anything. You could only work with what it gave you: the land, the weather, the seasons turning without waiting for anyone to be ready. You became, over time, a person who worked with what was given rather than grieving what wasn't. And that made you a different person than you'd started out as. And sometimes that different person was someone you were glad to be. She sat beside her husband and looked at the dark. Somewhere in the house, their guest was sleeping. Her children too. And whatever came next, the morning, the work, the next letter, the next fight, the slow, grinding progress of trying to make the world slightly more decent than you found it, would come when it came, and they would meet it the way they'd met everything else. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without loss that stayed with you in the specific gravity of real things, but together and stubbornly and with their eyes open. That was enough. That had always been enough.